Imagine a plateau. Not a plateau you could cross in an afternoon, not a hill, not a tableland. Imagine the Iranian plateau, an enormous tilted slab of the earth, ringed on every side by mountain ranges that go up into the snow and the permanent cold, ranges so high and so continuous that they create, inside them, a world apart. The air there is thin and very clear. In summer the sun burns everything bronze and dry. In winter the cold comes down from the mountains with the patience of something that has no appointments to keep. And the wind that blows off the great salt desert at the center, the Dashta Kavir, where almost nothing lives, and the crust of the ground is white and it cracks under your feet, is a wind that has been blowing since before there were people to feel it. This is not a gentle land. This is a hard, beautiful, patient land, and it is one of the harder places on earth to make a life. And yet, let your body settle a little heavier as you listen to this. You do not need to hold any of it. The names and the dates and the battles will move past you like clouds over the plateau, and you do not need to catch a single one. This is a story that has been told for 2,500 years, to people sitting in lamplight and firelight and the blue glow of a screen, and it does not need your effort to survive the night. Let it carry you. That is what it was made for. From this hard plateau, from these cold valleys and wind-scoured ridges, there came in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era something the world had never seen, and has arguably never seen since. An empire so vast, so deliberately organized, so consciously generous in its administration, that at its greatest reach it touched 3 continents and 100 peoples, from the Greek cities of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus River, from the steppes of Central Asia to the first cataracts of the Nile. At its height, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, named for the ancestor from whom its royal line claimed descent, governed perhaps half of all the human beings alive on earth. No empire before it had come close. And yet, from this hard place, from these high cold valleys and these wind-scoured ridges, there came, in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, something that the world had never seen and has arguably never seen since. An empire so vast, so deliberately organized, so consciously humane in its administration, that when its armies stood at their furthest reach, they touched 3 continents and 100 peoples, from the Greek cities of the Aegean coast to the banks of the Indus River in what is now Pakistan, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the first cataracts of the Nile in the south. At its height, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, to give it its proper name, after the ancestor from whom its royal line claimed descent, ruled over perhaps half of all the human beings alive on earth. No empire before it had come close. No empire after it, for a very long time, would come close again. Its capital was Persepolis, the city of the Persians, and if you have seen its ruins, the great stone stairways, the towering columns still standing after 2,500 years, the carved processions of tribute-bearers from every nation of the earth marching in eternal silence across the polished stone, you have seen one of the most haunting places the ancient world left behind, not because it is intact, but because of what remains even in its ruin, the sheer scale of the ambition, the extraordinary fineness of the carving, and above all the strange quality of the processions, the way every nation is shown in its own dress, its own gifts, its own dignity, marching not in chains, but as participants, as if the whole point of the empire was not conquest, but gathering, not domination, but a kind of enormous, improbable family of peoples, brought together under the wing of the King of Kings. Whether that is what it truly was, we will spend the night exploring. The answer, like all true answers, is complicated, but that it aspired to something like that the Persians invented a model of empire quite different from the grinding terror machine of the Assyrians who came before them, is one of the genuinely surprising and important things about this story, and worth carrying with you into the dark. You do not need to hold on to any of it. The names will come and go: Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, names that ring like struck bronze, and the battles and the building programs and the royal roads and the intricate politics of a court that stretched across half the world. Let them move past you. The river of it is what matters. The long, astonishing, improbable flow of a civilization that rose from a cold plateau and remade the world, and whose echoes, in the religions we still practice, the administrative ideas we still use, the very words we speak, have never entirely faded. We are, in ways most of us never think about, still living in a world the Persians helped to make. That is the gift the night has for you, if you stay awake long enough to receive it. And if you don't, if the story carries you under before we reach the end, that is exactly what it was made for. The empire will still be here in the morning. It has waited 2,500 years already. It can wait a little longer. So close your eyes and let the mountains begin. Where are you listening from tonight? Whatever your answer, whatever city or town or quiet room you are in, know that someone, 2,500 years ago, on the other side of the world, on a cold plateau under a sky full of stars, made something that reached this far. That is the first gift of the night. Settle in. We have a long way to go and all the time in the world to go it. The fire has been burning for 2,500 years. It was burning when Alexander came over the Hellespont with his 40,000 men and his copy of Homer. It was burning when the Arab armies swept up from the south and changed the world again. It was burning through all the long centuries of forgetting, in the hands of priests who did not stop, who could not imagine stopping, because stopping was unthinkable, because the fire was the truth and the truth did not go out simply because the empire had. It is burning tonight, somewhere, on a high plateau under a sky full of stars, and it will be burning when you wake. That is the first and the last thing to know about Persia. It began with a fire, and the fire has not gone out. To understand what Cyrus the Great did, you have to first understand the world he walked into. The ancient, overcrowded, furiously contested world of the Near East in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era. A world of great powers balanced against each other like stones in an arch, each one pressing against the others, none quite strong enough to bring the whole structure down alone. In the West, Egypt, ancient beyond reckoning, the civilization of the pyramids and the pharaohs, wounded now and a little diminished from its greatest days, but still immensely wealthy and proud, still capable of fielding armies and funding wars across the whole eastern Mediterranean. In the north, Lydia, the kingdom of Croesus, a name that became synonymous with wealth itself, for Lydia sat on rivers that ran with gold dust and had, among its many inventions, developed something very close to the first true coinage, the first money in the modern sense, minted in electrum and stamped with the royal seal. Croesus of Lydia was, by the measure of his age, the richest man in the world, and he knew it, and it made him careless in the way that great wealth always makes people careless, confident that money could buy any outcome, that the gods favored the prosperous, that the future would resemble the comfortable present. In the northeast, the Medes, the Iranian people who had been the great power of the plateau for the better part of a century, who had helped destroy Assyria in that furious generation we spoke of when we told the story of Babylon, and who now ruled a vast territory from their capital at Ecbatana, in the cool mountain valleys of what is now northwestern Iran. The Medes were Persian cousins, speaking a related language, worshipping related gods, living a similar life of horses and mountains and the seasonal rhythms of the high plateau. They were, in a sense, the older branch of the family, the ones who had made good first, who had inherited Assyria's mantle and grown comfortable in it, and who regarded the Persians of the south as junior relations, subordinate and useful, but not quite the equals of the Median lords. And there was Babylon, the great city, the gate of the god, whose story we have already told in full, the ancient and holy and magnificent center of the plain, ruled now by the last of its Chaldean kings, Nabonidus, whose quarrel with his own god Marduk was, as we have seen, already weakening the foundations of the greatest city in the world from within. This was the board as it stood when Cyrus, king of the small Persian tribe of the Achaemenids, lord of the district of Anshan in the southern part of the plateau, began his astonishing career. He was not, at the outset, a great king. He was a vassal, a subordinate ruler under the Median overlordship, a minor player in the great game of the Near East, governing a patch of high country that the major powers barely bothered to notice. If you had told any of the great kings of the age, Croesus of Lydia, Nabonidus of Babylon, Astyages of Media, that this obscure Persian lord would within 20 years have swallowed all of their kingdoms and remade the map of the world, they would have laughed at you, or had you executed for the insult of the comparison. It would have seemed that absurd. The future always does. Let the names of those kingdoms drift past you for now. Lydia, Media, Babylon, Elam, the rich list of the ancient world. You do not need to hold them. They will come back, each in its hour, when the story needs them. For now, only this. The world was full, and balanced, and old, and certain of itself. And from the margin of it, a minor king was watching and waiting, with the patience of a man who has decided something in private and is willing to wait as long as necessary for the world to be ready to hear it. The story of how Cyrus rose is wrapped, even in the ancient sources, in legend, and the legends are worth telling, because legends are the stories a people choose to tell about themselves, and the legends that gathered around Cyrus tell us something true about what the Persian world valued and what it found remarkable in its greatest king. The oldest surviving account of his origins comes from Herodotus, the Greek historian who wrote within living memory of the events he described, and who gathered his material from travelers and informants across the whole Persian world. And the story Herodotus tells is one of the most archetypal in all of ancient literature, the story of the king who tries to destroy a child and fails because destiny cannot be outrun. Astyages, king of the Medes, dreamed twice. The dreams of kings in that age were never merely dreams, and both times his diviners read the same message, that the child of his daughter Mandane would one day overthrow him and rule in his place. Astyages gave Mandane in marriage to a Persian, a deliberate choice, for the Persians were subordinate to Media, and a half-Persian child would have a weaker claim. And when the child was born, he ordered his most trusted general, Harpagus, to take the infant into the mountains and leave him to die. Harpagus, unwilling to do the deed himself, passed the child to a herdsman, with orders to expose it. And the herdsman, whose own child had just been born dead, could not bring himself to do it either. He and his wife kept the living child and buried their dead one in its place, and the boy grew up among the herds on the mountain, strong and clever, already a natural leader of the other children, already, the story says, playing at being king before he knew he was one. When he was 10 years old, the game gave him away. The way he commanded the other children, the way he bore himself, the way he absorbed punishment without breaking. And Astyages, summoned to judge the case, looked at the boy and saw in his face the ghost of the dream, and knew too late what he had failed to do. The herdsman confessed. Harpagus was punished in the most terrible way the age could devise, and the boy, Cyrus, already a king in miniature, was sent back to his Persian parents to grow into what the dream had promised. It is a beautiful story, and it shares its bones with a dozen other stories the ancient world loved to tell. Moses in the basket, Romulus and Remus with the wolf, Oedipus on the mountainside, the foundling king, the failed destruction, the destiny that will not be denied. We cannot know how much of it is true, and the Babylonian and Persian records that survive give us a rather different, more prosaic account of Cyrus's origins. But the story is true in the way that matters. It captures something real about how this man appeared to the world he conquered and the people who came after him, which is, as a figure of almost supernatural inevitability, a person whom history had been waiting for, who arrived at exactly the moment when the old order was ready to break and the new one was ready to be born. What we know with more confidence is this. Around the year 559 before the Common Era, Cyrus became king of the Persians, the Achaemenid clan, ruling from the city of Pasargadae in the fertile valley of the Murghab River in the south of the plateau, and almost immediately he moved against the power that had held the Persians as subordinates for a generation, Media. The Median general Harpagus, the same man, legend says, whom Astyages had so brutally punished for his failure to kill the infant Cyrus, turned his army around and went over to the Persian side, and with that defection the battle was decided before it was fought. Astyages was captured, Ecbatana, the Median capital, fell, and Cyrus, with a pragmatism that would characterize everything he did not destroy his defeated enemy, or raise his capital, or terrorize his new subjects. He kept Ecbatana as a royal residence. He incorporated the Median nobility into his own court. He adopted Median court dress and Median court ceremony. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror who had overthrown the Medes, but as their legitimate successor, the natural heir of the Median Empire, as if he had not conquered them at all, but simply extended the family. It was an astonishing political move, and it worked. The Medes, far from becoming a resentful subject people, became partners in the new enterprise, their officers serving in his armies, their nobles marrying into his court, the distinction between Mede and Persian blurring almost immediately into the compound identity that the Greeks would simply call Persian, and the world would marvel at for 2 centuries. The king who should have paid the closest attention to the fall of Media was Croesus of Lydia, but Croesus was the kind of man who paid attention to the things he wanted to hear, which is the oldest and most dangerous kind of deafness. When word reached him of this new Persian power rising in the east, Croesus did what any sensible ruler of his age would do. He consulted the oracle, not just any oracle, the great oracle at Delphi, the most famous in the Greek world, whose pronouncements were sought by kings and cities from the far western Mediterranean to the borders of Asia. And the oracle, in its famous way, told him exactly what he wanted to hear. If Croesus crossed the Halys River and attacked the Persians, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus heard this as a promise of victory. He had no idea, or would not allow himself to have the idea, that the great empire the oracle meant might be his own. He crossed the river anyway. He allied himself with Babylon and with Sparta, building the coalition he thought would crush the upstart Persian. He met Cyrus in battle at Pteria, in central Anatolia, in a great clash that ended, inconveniently, in a draw. Neither side broken, both sides bloodied, the issue unresolved. And then Croesus did the thing that sealed his fate. He went home for the winter. In that age, campaigns had seasons. You fought in summer and rested in winter, and everyone knew it, and the rules were so well understood that to break them seemed almost unsporting. He sent his allies home. He disbanded part of his army. He waited in his golden capital of Sardis for the spring, at which point he would resume the campaign with fresh forces. What he did not allow for, what could not have been predicted by any reasonable calculation of the customs of war, was Cyrus. Cyrus did not stop for winter. Cyrus marched through the cold season, across the plateau and into Anatolia, appearing before the walls of Sardis before Croesus had time to reassemble his forces, before the allies could be recalled, before the situation could be recovered. The battle was brief and total. Sardis fell. Croesus was captured, alive, because Cyrus wanted him alive, because the man who had been the richest king in the world was too valuable, too interesting, too symbolic a prize to simply execute. What happened next became one of the most famous stories of the ancient world. Cyrus, according to the sources, built a great pyre and had Croesus placed on top of it, intending, whether as execution or as ritual, to burn the Lydian king alive. And Croesus, standing in the smoke of the kindling, called out a name, Solon. The Greek sage Solon, who had visited his court years before in the golden days of his prosperity, had told him something he had not wanted to hear, that no man could be called happy until his life was over, because fortune could reverse at any moment, because the gods were jealous of too much happiness, because the count was not finished until it was finished. Croesus had dismissed the warning then. He was calling for it now, too late, on a burning pyre, as the fire caught around his feet. And Cyrus, curious, moved perhaps by something in the spectacle, something in the name being called out, asked what Croesus was saying, was told, thought about it, and then, the story says, ordered the fire put out. Not because he had gone soft, because he had, in that moment, understood something that most conquerors never understand at all, that he too was mortal, that his own fortune could reverse, that the man burning on the pyre was a lesson in exactly the kind of hubris that destroys kings, and that a king who watched such a lesson without learning from it was a fool. Croesus lived. He became, by some accounts, a counselor to Cyrus, the ultimate paradox, the conquered king advising the conqueror, the ruin that had become a kind of wisdom. The story may be embellished, the impulse behind it, that Cyrus was a man capable of mercy and of learning, is consistent with everything else we know about him. We have already, in the story of Babylon, told how Cyrus came to the greatest city in the world and took it without a battle, walking in through gates that opened before him, as if the city itself had decided to accept its new master. But it is worth dwelling here, in the Persian story, on what Cyrus did next, because it is the act for which he is most remembered, the act that made him, uniquely among the conquerors of the ancient world, a figure that the conquered peoples celebrated rather than mourned. He issued a proclamation. It survives, a small clay cylinder, covered in Babylonian cuneiform, found in the ruins of Babylon in the 19th century, and now housed in the British Museum in London, one of the most remarkable objects the ancient world has left us. And what it says, in the careful language of royal proclamation, is this: that Marduk, the great god of Babylon, had searched all the lands for a righteous king and had chosen Cyrus, that Cyrus had entered Babylon as a friend and protector, not a conqueror, that he had put an end to the oppression of Nabonidus and restored the proper worship of the god, and that he was returning to their homelands all the peoples whom the Babylonians had deported, allowing them to go back to their cities, to rebuild their temples, to worship their own gods in their own way. The peoples of many lands, the text lists them by name, nations from across the Near East, were free to go home. Among those peoples were the Jews of Judah, the exiles who had wept by the rivers of Babylon, who had hung their harps on the willows, and asked how they could sing the Lord's song in a strange land. Cyrus set them free. He gave them back their sacred vessels from the temple Nebuchadnezzar had looted. He gave them permission and resources to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. And in the Hebrew scriptures, this act was remembered as an act of God. Cyrus was called, astonishingly, an anointed one, a Messiah, the only foreign king in the entire Bible to be granted that title, the instrument of divine deliverance for a people who had been in captivity for 2 generations. The man who freed them was not even a monotheist. He worshipped, in his own way, his own gods. But he freed them anyway, because his policy was not the imposition of one god, or one culture, or one way of being human, but the accommodation of all of them under the vast and tolerant wing of the Persian King of Kings. This is the idea at the heart of the Persian experiment, and it is genuinely new in the history of power. The Assyrians had built their empire on terror and deportation, on the systematic destruction of local identities, on the message that submission meant erasure. Cyrus, and after him, the Achaemenid kings who followed, built theirs on something more subtle and, in the long run, more durable, on the message that submission meant participation. That being part of the Persian Empire did not mean ceasing to be Babylonian, or Jewish, or Lydian, or Egyptian, that your gods would be respected, and your customs honored, and your local elites incorporated into the administrative structure of the whole. It was not perfect. No empire is, and the Persians were capable of great violence when they chose to be, as the Greeks would discover in ways that burned into their cultural memory for centuries. But as a model of imperial administration, it was a genuine innovation, and it echoed forward in time, influencing the way Alexander the Great tried to rule his own conquest, the way the Romans thought about provincial governance, and in a diffuse but real way, the modern idea that a state can contain many peoples without requiring them all to be the same. With Lydia taken and Babylon taken, Cyrus turned east, and here the story grows harder to follow, because the eastern campaigns are less well documented, the Greek sources thinner, the Persian records sparser, and the geography itself more forbidding. What we know is that Cyrus pushed the Persian border far into Central Asia, into the lands we now call Afghanistan, and the steppes beyond, the territories of nomadic peoples who had no cities to besiege and no fixed armies to defeat, who melted away before a conventional army and returned the moment it had passed, the eternal frustration of the settled world trying to subdue the mobile one. He founded cities in the east, Acropolis, city of Cyrus, among others, planting Persian settlements as anchors in the new territories, as Rome would later plant colonies, and Britain would later plant trading posts, trying to fix in place the fluid boundary between the known world and the wilderness beyond. And somewhere in those eastern campaigns, Cyrus died. The exact circumstances are disputed. Herodotus gives a detailed and dramatic account that most modern scholars regard with suspicion, involving a campaign against the Massageti, a fierce nomadic people of the steppes north of the Caspian, led by a queen named Tomyris. In the story, Cyrus was defeated and killed, and Tomyris, whose son he had captured and driven to suicide earlier in the campaign, found his body on the battlefield and thrust his head into a wineskin full of blood, saying, "You thirsted for blood, drink your fill." It is a magnificent story, and it may even be partly true. What is certain is that Cyrus died in the east, around the year 530 before the Common Era, after a reign of perhaps 30 years, having transformed a minor Persian kingdom into the largest empire the world had yet seen. He was brought back for burial to Pasargadae, the first capital of his kingdom, the place where he had started. His tomb still stands there, in the plain of Murghab in southern Iran, a simple structure by the standards of what the empire would later build, a gabled chamber of white limestone on a stepped base, sitting alone in what was once a garden, the garden now gone, the surrounding palace ruins scattered across the plain. It is modest, for what it contains. An ancient account records the inscription that was carved above its door, though the inscription itself has not survived. "O man, whoever you are, and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my body. It may be invented. It is certainly in the spirit of everything we know about the man, an empire won by a person who could imagine the stranger standing over his grave, and wanted to speak to that stranger, not with boasting but with a kind of quiet reasonableness, a recognition of shared mortality across the centuries. The greatest conqueror of his age, asking only not to be begrudged a little earth. It is, if nothing else, a beautiful way to want to be remembered. Let your breathing slow a little here, if it hasn't already. The first great chapter of the story is complete. If you are already drifting, Let yourself drift, the empire will keep. If you are still with us, settle deeper, and we will go on. Every great founder is followed, sooner or later, by a son who is not the father. It is one of the reliable patterns of the ancient world, and it held for the Persians as surely as for everyone else. Cyrus was followed by his son Cambyses, and Cambyses was, by any measure, a more difficult figure. Ambitious enough to extend the empire further than his father had taken it, capable enough to accomplish the most audacious military feat of the age, but haunted by something, some darkness in the personality that the ancient sources dwell on with evident fascination, and that the Egyptian records, at least, suggest was not entirely invention. What Cambyses did that was extraordinary was conquer Egypt. This was not a small thing. Egypt was ancient beyond reckoning, protected by desert on every side, watered by the Nile in a way that made it uniquely self-sufficient, defended by a professional army, and by the sheer weight of its own prestige. The civilization that had stood for 2,000 years before Persia existed was not something you took on lightly, but Cambyses did in 525 before the Common Era, and he succeeded, routing the Egyptian army at the Battle of Pelusium, capturing the pharaoh Psamtik III, and adding the entire kingdom of the Nile to the Persian Empire, which now stretched from the Aegean coast to the borders of Libya, from the Black Sea to the first cataract of the Nile, an almost incomprehensible span of the earth's surface. The Persian king was now also pharaoh of Egypt, and Cambyses, following his father's model, attempted at first to present himself as a legitimate Egyptian ruler rather than a foreign conqueror, participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies, adopting Egyptian titles. But here the model seems to have broken down, or the sources say it did, and we must be careful, because our main source for what followed is Herodotus, who was drawing on Egyptian informants who had every reason to paint the Persian king in the worst possible light. According to these accounts, Cambyses became, in Egypt, erratic and cruel, that he mocked Egyptian religion, stabbed the sacred bull Apis with his own hand, opened the tombs of the pharaohs and desecrated the mummies, executed advisors on whims, murdered his own brother Smerdis out of paranoia and killed his sister, whom he had taken as a wife, in a fit of rage. He led a disastrous campaign into the Libyan desert to the west, where his army vanished. 50,000 men, the stories say, swallowed by a sandstorm and never seen again, though this figure strains credulity. He sent another expedition south, up the Nile toward Ethiopia, which also failed. The picture Herodotus paints is of a king losing his grip, a brilliant conqueror undone by something in his own nature, the empire straining at the edges he had pushed it to. How much of this is true is genuinely uncertain. Persian and Babylonian records from the same period paint a rather different Cambyses, less erratic, more conventionally capable, the bull Apis episode in particular, contradicted by an inscription that shows Cambyses providing for the animal's burial with apparent respect. The truth is probably somewhere between the Persian official record, flattering, and the Egyptian popular memory, hostile. A king capable of great military achievements, who became, under the pressures of ruling an empire from a distance while campaigning in a foreign land, increasingly isolated and increasingly ruthless, as power without accountability tends to make people. He died in 522, on his way back to Persia to deal with a rebellion, a wound to his thigh, the sources say, in the same spot where he had stabbed the sacred bull, which the Egyptians took as divine justice and we may take as coincidence. He left no son, and the empire, for a terrifying moment, teetered. What happened next in Persia is one of the strangest and most debated episodes in all of ancient history, and it begins with a mystery that has never been fully resolved. When Cambyses died, the throne was claimed by a man who said he was Smerdis, the brother whom Cambyses had allegedly already murdered. Was this really Smerdis, miraculously alive? Was it an impostor, a Median magus named Gormata who had seized the throne by pretending to be the dead prince? We do not know, and we cannot know, because the man who eventually won the throne, Darius, had every reason to tell the story in the way that most justified his own seizure of power, and the version we have is Darius's version, carved in his own words into the rock of a mountain in western Iran, at a place called Behistun, in letters 60 feet high, in 3 languages, so that no one who passed on the royal road below could miss it. The Behistun inscription is one of the great documents of the ancient world, and we will return to it. For now, what matters is the story it tells, that the man on the throne was an impostor, a fraud, a Median magus who had no right to be there, that Darius, a Persian nobleman of the Achaemenid line, related to Cyrus through a collateral branch of the family, had recognized the fraud, gathered 6 noble co-conspirators, and in a palace coup of almost cinematic audacity had burst into the impostor's chamber and killed him, thereby saving the Persian Empire from the rule of a lie. The 6 conspirators then agreed among themselves that whichever of their horses neighed first at sunrise the next morning would supply the new king. Darius's horse neighed first. Darius became king. So he says. What actually happened we cannot know. It is at least as plausible that Smerdis was real, that Cambyses had not actually killed his brother, and that Darius was simply a usurper who took advantage of the confusion of the moment to seize the throne and then constructed an elaborate justification afterward. The modern historian David Lewis pointed out that the story has suspiciously convenient features: the dead brother, the fake impostor, the horse neigh deciding the succession, that look more like political mythology than political history. But Darius had the throne, and Darius had the inscription, and Darius had 35 years to consolidate his power and remake the empire in his own image. And so, whatever the truth of his accession, the reign of Darius the Great is the reign that gave the Persian Empire the form that would last for 2 centuries. The administrative structure, the roads, the coinage, the legal system, the magnificent buildings at Persepolis, and the reach that would, at its furthest extension, clash with the world of the Greeks and leave a scar in Western memory that has never entirely healed. He did not come to any of this easily. The first years of his reign were consumed by revolt everywhere, simultaneously, as if the whole empire had been waiting for exactly this moment of uncertainty to test the new king. Babylon revolted, twice. Media revolted. Egypt stirred. The eastern provinces rose. In his own words, at Behistun, Darius lists 19 battles fought in a single year, 9 rebel kings defeated and captured and displayed before his assembled army, each one presented in a carved relief with his foot on his neck and his hands bound behind him, the symbolic vocabulary of absolute power, made literal in stone. He put down every rebellion, one by one, with a speed and organization that suggests a military and administrative genius of the first order. Not the brooding, erratic figure of Cambyses, but something colder and more formidable. A systematic man, a man who understood that an empire this large could only be held together by institutions rather than by the personality of any single ruler, however extraordinary. The great achievement of Darius, the one that outlasted all his campaigns and his buildings and his inscription, was institutional. He looked at the empire Cyrus and Cambyses had assembled by conquest, an empire so large and so diverse that no single method of rule could possibly reach from one end of it to the other, and he designed a system for governing it that was, in its essentials, the most sophisticated administrative apparatus the ancient world had yet produced. The system was the satrapy. The Persian Empire was divided into provinces, satrapies, from the Persian word for governor, satrap, each one large enough to be a kingdom in its own right, each one administered by a satrap who was typically a Persian nobleman, often a member of the royal family or closely connected to it, who governed his province with wide authority, collecting taxes, maintaining order, raising troops, administering justice. The satrap was, within his province, nearly a king, and this is where the genius of the system reveals itself, because Darius understood that a system this decentralized needed a counterweight, and he provided one: the king's eye and the king's ear. These were royal inspectors, officials sent directly from the court, independent of the satraps, with the authority to investigate and report and, if necessary, to remove. The satrap could govern his province, but he could not hide from the center. The king's eye was always watching. It was, in embryo, a system of checks and balances in an absolute monarchy, the kind of institutional paranoia that keeps a far-flung administration honest, or at least honest enough. And then there were the roads, the royal road, the great highway that Darius built or formalized across the length of his empire, running from the Aegean coast at Sardis all the way to the Persian heartland at Susa and beyond, was one of the engineering achievements of the age. Not a road in the modern sense of poured concrete, but a maintained track, wide enough for wheeled vehicles, furnished at intervals of a day's ride with posting stations where fresh horses waited, and couriers who would take a message from one station to the next, passing it along like a relay until it reached its destination at the far end of the empire. Herodotus, who was impressed, calculated the journey from Sardis to Susa at 3 months on foot, and noted that the royal couriers, changing horses at every station, could cover the same distance in a week. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night, he wrote, stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, words that would later be adopted, in the modern age, as the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service, which had no idea it was quoting an ancient Greek writer describing a Persian innovation, and which is perhaps the most unlikely inheritance of the Achaemenid Empire in the modern world. The road connected the empire, the satrapy system governed it, and to hold the whole thing together, Darius introduced something else that Cyrus had gestured toward, but not fully developed. A common coinage, the gold daric and the silver siglos, stamped with the image of the king himself, running, armed with bow and spear, in the kneeling running posture that Persian art used for royal action. The first coins to carry the face of a living ruler, spreading the image of the King of Kings to every market and every pocket in the empire. Money, roads, provincial government, royal inspection, the bones of the imperial machine, assembled by one systematic mind in a period of remarkable energy and invention, and durable enough to outlast its maker by 2 centuries. And then there was the building. Because for all his administrative genius, Darius was also a builder of extraordinary ambition, and the monument he left behind, begun by him and continued by his son Xerxes and his successors, is the most astonishing thing the Persian world produced, the place where the idea of the empire became stone, where the abstraction of the King of Kings was made visible in carved processions and soaring columns, and the accumulated work of craftsmen from every corner of the ancient world. Persepolis. The site was chosen by Darius himself, on a natural terrace at the foot of the Ku'e Ramat, the Mountain of Mercy, in the heartland of Persia in the province of Fars. He had a great platform of stone built, partly natural rock, partly constructed fill, extending some 450 meters by 300, raised above the surrounding plain on a terrace of dressed stone courses, approached by a great double-returned staircase broad enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast. On this platform he began to build, and what he built, and what his successors added and refined over the next century and a half, was not a city in the ordinary sense, but a ceremonial capital, a place not primarily for living, but for the great ritual occasions of the Persian year. Above all, the Nowruz, the Persian New Year, when delegations from every nation of the empire came to Persepolis to pay their respects to the king, to bring their tribute, to be received in the great audience hall, and stand before the throne of the King of Kings. The audience hall, the Apadana as it was called, was the largest room in the world. 100 columns, 60 meters on a side, a roof of cedar from Lebanon raised on columns that were, by themselves, 20 meters tall, their capitals formed as the heads of kneeling bulls or fighting animals, supporting the great cedar beams above. The columns are gone now, fallen, or burned, or carried away, but many of the bases remain, and a few of the columns still stand, and even the bases give you a sense of the scale, the absolutely preposterous human ambition of the thing, the decision to build not the biggest room you could build, but the biggest room you could imagine, and then to build it in the most refined and beautiful way possible, with a quality of carving and a precision of stonework that the best craftsmen of 5 different cultures working together could achieve, because that is the other thing about Persepolis. It was built by everyone. The workforce records survive. They are among the most remarkable documents of the ancient world. Thousands of clay tablets found at Persepolis in the 20th century, recording the rations and wages paid to workers, listing their nationalities and their skills, and their daily pay, in silver and wine and grain. The workers came from across the empire, Lydians and Babylonians and Egyptians and Ionians and Carians and Medes and Persians, each people bringing their own techniques and their own traditions. The result is a style that is, strictly speaking, not quite like anything else, not purely Persian, not purely Babylonian, not purely Egyptian or Greek, but a synthesis, something new made from the combination of all of them, the visual language of an empire that genuinely contained multitudes, and at the heart of that visual language, running across the great stairways of the Apadana in long double registers of carved relief, is the image that is Persepolis's deepest statement, the procession of the nations. 23 delegations, each one identified by the dress it wears and the gifts it brings, each one led by a Persian or Median usher who takes the delegation representative by the hand and guides him forward toward the king. The Babylonians bring a humped bull and fine cloth. The Lydians bring metal vessels and a chariot. The Indians bring gold dust in reed containers and a donkey. The Ethiopians bring an okapi and an elephant tusk. The Armenians bring a horse and silver vessels. The Scythians bring horses and folded cloth, and so on through all 23, each delegation distinct, each people shown in its own clothing, its own ornaments, each carrying what its own land produces, each treated by the carved stone with the same careful attention and the same essential dignity. They are not in chains. They are not being driven at spear point. They are walking, led by the hand, guided forward to the great encounter with the king, as if the whole meaning of the empire is not their subjugation but their inclusion, their participation in something larger than any one of them could be alone. Whether this vision of the empire as a family of nations was lived reality or propaganda in stone, it is one of the most powerful political images the ancient world produced, and the fact that it was carved at the very center of Persian power on the stairway that every delegation climbed on its way to the king suggests that it was, at the very least, what the Persians wanted themselves and the world to believe about what they were doing. To understand the Persians, you must understand what they believed, and what they believed was, in the history of human religion, something genuinely revolutionary, something that would ripple outward from the Iranian plateau into Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the whole Western religious tradition in ways so deep that most people who have inherited those ripples have no idea where they originated. The religion of ancient Persia, the faith of Cyrus and Darius and the Achaemenid kings, was Zoroastrianism, the teaching of the prophet Zarathustra, whom the Greeks called Zoroaster, and it is one of the oldest still living religious traditions on earth. When Zoroaster lived is genuinely uncertain. The dates proposed by scholars range across more than 1,000 years, from before 1500 BCE to around 600 BCE, and the arguments on both sides are fierce and unresolved. What is less contested is what he taught, because the core of it is preserved in the Gathas, 17 hymns that Zoroaster himself composed, among the oldest religious poetry in existence, preserved in an archaic Iranian language so close to the Sanskrit of the Vedas that the two must be near simultaneous branches of the same ancestral trunk. The Gathas are direct and personal, and sometimes agonized, the words of a man who has had a revelation and is not sure the world wants to hear it, who is arguing with his neighbors and sometimes with his God, who feels the urgency of what he knows and the frustration of not being believed. What Zoroaster taught was, at its heart, a cosmic dualism. The world is a battleground between two primordial principles, Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the god of light and truth and creation, and Angra Mainyu, or Ahriman, the destructive spirit, the principle of darkness and lie and decay. These two principles are in eternal opposition, and every human being, in every choice and every action and every thought, is participating in that cosmic struggle, either advancing the forces of truth and light or surrendering to the forces of lie and darkness. The world was created good by Ahura Mazda. Evil entered it as an alien intrusion, and history is the long drama of the battle between them, a battle that will end. For Zoroastrianism is one of the very first religions to have a linear rather than cyclical view of time. In a final renovation of the world, a last judgment in which the dead are resurrected, the righteous separated from the wicked, evil definitively destroyed, and a perfect world established forever. Fire was the sacred symbol of Ahura Mazda's truth, not worshipped as a god itself, but honored as the visible presence of divine light in the material world, to be kept burning on the altar as a constant reminder of the struggle between light and darkness. This matters for our story in several ways. First, it matters because it shaped the distinctly Persian imperial ideology. The idea, expressed again and again in the royal inscriptions, that the king rules by the grace of Ahura Mazda, that his enemies are the servants of the lie, that his wars are fought in the service of truth, that the whole vast imperial project is a cosmic as well as a political enterprise. The language of the Behistun inscription is saturated with this theology. The rebel kings are repeatedly described as liars, followers of the lie, men who have violated the cosmic order that Ahura Mazda has established. Darius is not merely a powerful king defeating political rivals, he is truth defeating lie, Ahura Mazda's instrument defeating Ahriman's servants. It is, of course, convenient political theology, but it is also sincere, as far as we can tell, the genuine framework through which the Persian kings understood their own power and its source. And second, it matters because Zoroastrianism, spreading westward with the Persian Empire and its peoples, introduced into the ancient Near East a cluster of ideas that would deeply influence the Judaism of the exile and post-exile period, and through Judaism, Christianity and Islam, the idea of a single supreme God in combat with a principle of evil, the idea of a linear history moving toward a final judgment, the idea of the resurrection of the dead and the separation of the righteous and the wicked. the idea of heaven and hell as distinct realms awaiting the virtuous and the sinful after death. None of these ideas appears in the earliest strata of Hebrew scripture. They appear in the later strata, in the books written during and after the Babylonian exile, when the Jews were living under Persian rule and Persian cultural influence. The connection is debated and complex, and the lines of influence are not simple or direct, but the timing is suggestive, and scholars across the last century have increasingly accepted that the encounter with Zoroastrianism in the Persian period helped shape the theological revolution within Judaism that would eventually produce the world-transforming religions of Christianity and Islam. The fire on the Zoroastrian altar is, in some sense, one of the distant ancestors of the candles burning in 10,000 churches and the lanterns in 10,000 mosques tonight. A thread so long and so fine that it has become invisible, but it is there. For the Greeks, who would write the history that most of the world later inherited, Persia meant above all one thing: the invasion. The two great Persian invasions of mainland Greece, in 490 and 480 before the Common Era, became the defining moment of Greek self-understanding, the story they told about themselves for centuries, the proof that freedom could defeat tyranny, that citizen soldiers fighting for their own land and their own laws could defeat the vast conscript armies of an oriental despot, that the small could overcome the great if they fought with enough courage and enough intelligence. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plateau. The names ring down through Western history as the founding moments of Western identity, the birth of the free world in the fire of Persian invasion. It is a magnificent story. It is also, like most magnificent stories, partial, told entirely from one side, by the winners, about the losers, and missing almost everything that the losers might have wanted to say about it. What actually brought Darius to Greece in 490? The answer is more complicated than the story of Oriental hubris and freedom-loving Greeks suggests. It begins, as so many Near Eastern conflicts do, with a local dispute that escalated into something larger than anyone intended. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, the western edge of Asia Minor, now the Aegean coast of modern Turkey, had been part of the Persian Empire since Cyrus's conquest of Lydia, and most of them had accommodated themselves to Persian rule without too much difficulty. They were governed by local tyrants, Greek rulers who had Persian support, who kept order and collected taxes, and were in return left to run their cities more or less as before. It was not, for most people most of the time, a terrible arrangement. But in 499, a faction of the Ionian Greeks rose in rebellion, the Ionian Revolt, and appealed to the mainland Greeks for help. Athens and the small city of Eretria sent ships and soldiers. The revolt lasted 6 years before Persia crushed it, burning the great Ionian city of Miletus to the ground as a lesson in the cost of rebellion. But the damage to Persian prestige was real, and the involvement of Athens and Eretria was, from Darius's point of view, an act of war by states that were officially at peace with Persia. States that had in fact, some years earlier, sent the symbolic gifts of earth and water that constituted formal submission to the Persian king. Their backing of the revolt was, in the language of Persian imperial politics, pure lie, a violation of the oath of submission, the kind of treachery that Ahura Mazda specifically required the king to punish. Darius sent a herald, the story goes, demanding earth and water, the traditional tokens of submission, from the mainland Greek cities. Most of them gave it. Athens threw the herald into a pit, Sparta threw theirs into a well, and so the expedition came, in 490. Not as a world-conquering crusade against the idea of freedom, but as a punitive expedition to bring two rebellious tributaries back to order, to teach Athens and Eretria the lesson that Miletus had been taught. It was probably not, in Darius's planning, expected to be a particularly difficult campaign. It did not go as planned. The Battle of Marathon, in 490 before the Common Era, is one of those rare events that genuinely changed the direction of history, not because of the size of the forces involved or the scale of the casualties, but because of what it proved and what it made possible and what it did to the imagination of the Greek world. A Persian expeditionary force of perhaps 20 to 30,000 men, the exact numbers are disputed, Herodotus's figure of 600,000 being one of his more obvious exaggerations, landed on the plain of Marathon on the northeastern coast of Attica and prepared to march on Athens. The Athenian army of perhaps 10,000 hoplites, joined by perhaps 1,000 men from the small city of Plataea, marched out to meet them. The Athenians had sent a runner to Sparta, a man named Phidippides, according to Herodotus, who ran 150 miles in 2 days, asking for Spartan help. The Spartans said they would come, but a religious festival meant they could not come yet. They could come after the full moon. Athens would have to wait, or fight alone. Athens fought, and won. The Persian army, accustomed to fighting against forces that broke under the shock of their great masses of infantry and cavalry and archers, met something it had not quite encountered before. The full charge of the Greek hoplite phalanx, heavily armoured men running in formation at the double, their shields locked and their long spears levelled, hitting the Persian line like a wall of bronze. The Persians broke. 7 Greek ships were sent back to Athens as a warning, an attempt to coordinate with traitors in the city who might open the gates while the army was away at Marathon. But the army, after the battle, marched back to Athens at extraordinary speed and arrived on the shore before the ships could land. The Persians, their plan foiled, sailed away, and in the aftermath, a runner, not Phidippides perhaps, but some anonymous man in the exhausted army, ran the 25 miles from the plain of Marathon to the city of Athens and delivered the news, victory, and then, the story says, fell dead. The news did not just travel 25 miles that day, it travelled across the Greek world and across history. A Greek army, Athenian citizen soldiers, men who had voted for their own commanders and fought under their own laws for their own city, had defeated a Persian army. It should not have been possible. The Persian Empire was the largest and most powerful state on earth. Athens was a city of perhaps 30,000 adult male citizens, and yet, the effect on Greek confidence was galvanic. A sudden, enormous surge of belief in their own capacity, their own identity, their own way of life. And the effect on Persia was to ensure that the next Persian expedition to Greece would not be a punitive raid, but a full-scale invasion, because Darius, who did not accept defeat, began immediately planning the campaign that would settle the matter once and for all. He died before he could launch it. The task fell to his son. The son of Darius, who came to the throne in 486, was a man of extraordinary presence and ambition, and of, perhaps, somewhat less extraordinary judgment. A man who inherited the largest empire in history, and whose greatest campaign would, in the long sweep of things, prove to be the beginning of its long decline, though no one could have seen it at the time. His name was Kushayasha, Xerxes, to the Greeks who feared and hated him, the name by which history knows him. He was tall, by Persian standards of ideal beauty magnificently handsome, and he had the absolute certainty of a man who had been raised from birth to believe that the world was his father's inheritance and would be his own. He also had a temper. The ancient sources agree on the temper. He spent the first years of his reign dealing with revolts in Egypt and Babylon, putting them down with a firmness that lacked his father's subtlety, imposing governors rather than cultivating local elites, removing from Babylon the sacred statue of Marduk that Cyrus had so carefully restored, the same act of religious insensitivity that had destroyed Nabonidus. Whether this represents a genuine change in Persian policy, or simply Xerxes' individual personality is debated. What it illustrates is that the careful balancing act of Achaemenid tolerance required constant, active maintenance, and that not every king was equally committed to or capable of it. And then came Greece. The expedition Xerxes launched against Greece in 480 was something no one had ever attempted. An invasion so vast in scope that it required 4 years of preparation and a mobilization of resources from across the entire Persian Empire. The numbers Herodotus gives are fantasy, but the reality was staggering enough. Hundreds of thousands of men drawn from every corner of the empire. Persians and Medes, Lydians and Ionians, Egyptians and Ethiopians, Babylonians and Indians and Bactrians, a genuine world army, the peoples of the Persepolis procession now marching to war, rather than bearing tribute. To cross the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe, Xerxes ordered a bridge of boats, 2 parallel lines of 360 ships, lashed together and planked over, with earthen ramps at either end so that horses and men could cross as if on dry land. When the first bridge was destroyed by a storm, Xerxes, in the most famous act of royal pique in ancient history, ordered the sea itself to be given 300 lashes with a chain and branded with hot irons, and had the engineers who built the failed bridge beheaded. Then he built a better bridge, and the army crossed. It took 7 days and 7 nights for the army to cross the bridge of boats at the Hellespont, the ancient sources say, with men marching continuously, night and day, pressed by whips if they slowed. Whether this is literally true or not, the image is real. The extraordinary spectacle of an empire on the move. The largest military force the Mediterranean world had yet seen, flowing from Asia into Europe, over a bridge of boats on a narrow strip of sea, with the King of Kings watching from a golden throne on the heights above, watching his power cross the water into a new continent. And Xerxes, the sources say, wept. His companion asked him why, and he said, "I was thinking about the brevity of human life, and how none of all these men will be alive in 100 years. It is a strange moment of melancholy in the middle of the greatest military mobilization of the age, and whether Herodotus invented it or preserves something real, it has the feel of truth, the moment when the man who has assembled absolute power looks at its fragility and feels, briefly, something very like what Cyrus felt above that Lydian pyre. The count is not finished until it is finished. The Persian army came south through Greece like a tide, and most of the Greek world did what most of the world does in the face of an apparently unstoppable force. It submitted. City after city sent their earth and water. The Persian fleet moved down the eastern coast. The Greek alliance that opposed Xerxes, a coalition of perhaps 30 city-states, led by Sparta and Athens, and always on the verge of dissolving into the old mutual hostilities that were the natural condition of the Greek world, decided to make a stand at the narrowest pass they could find, where the numbers of Persia would mean least. They found it at Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a coastal pass in central Greece where the mountains came down almost to the sea, and an army could be held by a small enough force to make the difference in numbers irrelevant. The force that held the pass was led by the Spartan king Leonidas, 300 Spartans, surrounded and supplemented by perhaps 7,000 allied Greeks from other cities, holding a narrow defile through which the army of Xerxes, however vast, could only pass a few men at a time. For 2 days they held. For 2 days the finest infantry in the world ground themselves against the Spartan shields and could not break through, and the Spartan dead were numbered in the handful, and the Persian dead in the thousands, and the pass held. And then, on the 3rd day, a local man named Ephialtes, a Greek, betraying Greeks, showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass, and the flanking force arrived at dawn on the 3rd day, and Leonidas knew it was over. He sent most of the allied Greeks away. He kept his 300 Spartans, and with them a few hundred Thespians who refused to leave, and a contingent of Thebans whom he may have held partly as hostages. The reason he stayed, the Spartans said, was simple. The law of Sparta did not permit a Spartan soldier to retreat. And there was another reason, more strategic than noble. Someone had to stay and die here, so that the Greek world would know what resistance looked like, so that the memory of what 300 men chose to do in a narrow pass above the sea would burn in the Greek imagination long after the pass was lost and the army was gone. It was not, in other words, a purely tactical decision. It was a decision about what kind of story was needed and what kind of sacrifice could tell it. Leonidas chose to be the story. The 300 were killed to the last man, overwhelmed in the end on a small hill behind the pass where they made their final stand, buried under the arrows of the Persian archers. A stone was set over their graves, and on it was carved the epigram of Simonides, words so perfectly made that they have never been bettered in 2,500 years. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. It is perhaps the most famous war memorial ever written, and it is, in its quiet way, an answer to Xerxes weeping on his throne above the Hellespont. Yes, human life is brief, but what is done in that brevity is not nothing. The 300 were dead. The story lived. If you are still awake for this, let the words rest in you a moment before we move on. If you have heard of Thermopylae before tonight, perhaps it means something different now, seen from the Persian side, from the throne above the water, from the empire that moved the whole world and lost it anyway. That double vision is what this channel is for. Hold both if you can, and let your eyes grow heavy. The Persian army took Athens. This is the part of the story that the later Greek tradition tends to skip over quickly, because it is uncomfortable. The fall of the city that would become, in the Western imagination, the cradle of democracy and the philosophical center of the world. But Athens fell, in 480, because Athens had been evacuated. The Athenian statesman Themistocles had read an ambiguous oracle from Delphi. The oracle had spoken of a wooden wall as Athens' salvation, and had made the bold interpretation that the wooden wall meant the fleet, the Athenian navy of nearly 200 ships that he had spent the previous decade building with the silver from the mines at Laurion. He persuaded the Athenians to put their women and children and old people on ships and on the island of Salamis and on the Peloponnesian coast, and to man the fleet and to fight at sea, where the numbers of Persia's land army would mean nothing. The Persian army entered an empty city and burned it. The Acropolis, the temples, everything. And then the Persian fleet came south to finish the campaign, to destroy the Greek fleet and open the sea route for the Persian army to continue into the Peloponnese, to take Sparta, to end the war. What happened instead? In the narrow waters between Salamis and the Attic coast, in September of 480, was one of the decisive days in the history of the world. The Greek fleet, 378 triremes against perhaps 500 or more Persian vessels, lured the Persian fleet into the narrow strait where numbers were again equalized by geography, and fought them. The Persian ships, larger and less maneuverable, could not deploy their advantage in the strait. The Greek triremes, lighter and faster, and handled by men fighting in sight of their own city and their own families, drove into the Persian fleet with the rams of their bronze prows and did not stop. By evening the Persian fleet was wrecked, hundreds of ships sunk or captured, the sea choked with the dead. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on the heights above, the same posture of observation as above the Hellespont, the throne carried wherever the king went, so that he could watch his empire in action, saw his fleet destroyed before his eyes, and knew that without control of the sea, his army in Greece was stranded, dependent on a supply line it could no longer protect. He retreated. He left a large army under his best general Mardonius to winter in Greece, and finish the campaign in the spring. But the heart had gone out of the enterprise. Mardonius was defeated the following year at Plataea. On the same day, the tradition insisted, though the date seems too perfectly symbolic to be trusted literally, as the Greek fleet destroyed the remnants of the Persian navy at Mycale. The invasion was over. Persia had lost. And the Greek world, astonished by what it had survived, began the extraordinary cultural explosion that we call the Golden Age of Athens, building the Parthenon, and writing the tragedies, and arguing in the Agora, and thinking the thoughts that would become the philosophical and artistic foundation of everything we call Western civilization, building it, at least partly, in the energized confidence of a people who had looked at the most powerful empire on earth, and found that they could say no. The world that Xerxes came home to after the failure in Greece was not the world his father had built. Or rather, it was the same world, but seen through different eyes, the eyes of a king who had watched his fleet burn, and had come back without the triumph he had promised himself. The Greek sources, drawing on a tradition of Persian court gossip that the Greek-speaking educated elite of the empire fed out in the centuries that followed, paint the later years of Xerxes as a retreat from the hard business of empire, into the soft pleasures of the court, into the harem, into wine, into the elaborate rituals of deference and consumption that surrounded the great king at Persepolis and Susa and Ecbatana, moving between his capitals with the seasons, attended by the vast apparatus of household and court that made the Persian king's residence a mobile city wherever it went. Whether or not this is fair, it points to something real about the nature of the Achaemenid court and the peculiar dynamics of power that it generated, which are unlike anything else in the ancient world and which deserve an hour of attention, because they are one of the things that makes the Persian story genuinely strange and human and real under the official grandeur of the inscriptions. The Persian king lived surrounded by people whose entire existence was organized around his pleasure and his preservation, and who were, in consequence, locked in perpetual competition with one another for access to the royal presence, for the favor that meant wealth and safety and position, and whose withdrawal meant ruin. The court was a machine for producing intrigue, and the intrigue it produced was, by the later Achaemenid period, very nearly its primary product. At the center of that world were the women, the queens and the royal mothers and the concubines, who occupied a position in Persian power that is genuinely unusual for the ancient world, and whose influence was both real and officially invisible, exercised through access to the king rather than through formal power. The most formidable of them were figures of remarkable force. Atossa, daughter of Cyrus and wife of Darius, appears in the sources as a woman of genuine political weight, who is credited with urging the Greek expedition, and whose influence over the succession was decisive. Parysatis, mother of Artaxerxes Tut and the younger Cyrus, emerges from the ancient accounts as a woman of ferocious political intelligence and equally ferocious maternal protectiveness, a figure who poisoned her enemies, maneuvered between her son's rival claims to the throne, and survived everything the court could throw at her through decades of ruthless play. These women do not appear in the great carved processions of Persepolis. They are invisible in the official ideology of the empire, but they were present, and they mattered, and the court without them is incomprehensible. And the eunuchs. The Persian court, like other great courts of the ancient Near East, relied heavily on eunuchs, men who had been castrated in boyhood and who served in the intimate spaces of the palace that were closed to intact men, in the women's quarters and the royal bedchamber and the private treasury. Eunuchs could be trusted in ways that intact men could not. They had no wives, no children, no dynasties to found, no ambitions that ran to the procreation of heirs, and so they were used in the most sensitive positions of personal service to the king. And because they were trusted, and because they were physically close to the royal presence, and because physical closeness to the king was the basis of all real power in the court, eunuchs in the Persian system accumulated enormous informal influence, serving as intermediaries and gatekeepers, and, sometimes, as genuine kingmakers. The assassination of Xerxes in 465, killed in his bedchamber in the dead of night, along with his eldest son, was carried out by a senior court official with the help of, according to most ancient accounts, a powerful eunuch, the most powerful man in the world, the king of kings, lord of an empire stretching from Greece to India, was stabbed to death in his sleep by people he trusted to be near him in the dark. It is one of the recurring images of the Achaemenid story, the vast exterior power, and the intimate vulnerability at its center, the enormous apparatus of royal authority resting, finally, on the fragile body of a mortal man in a dark room. After the drama of the invasions and the court murders, the Persian Empire settled into something that is, for the writer of history, less immediately exciting, but more genuinely important. A long period of relative stability, of administrative competence, of cultural flourishing under kings whose names are less famous than Cyrus or Xerxes, but whose reigns shaped the world their subjects lived in for generations. The long Achaemenid century between the death of Xerxes and the arrival of Alexander, the reigns of Artaxerxes the Fars, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, and the brief and unhappy tenures at the end, is the Persian Empire at its most ordinary, which is to say, at its most genuinely imperial. Governing, taxing, administering, adjudicating, building, funding the arts, and managing the endless complications of an empire that contained more peoples and more languages and more gods than any state had ever before attempted to hold. The peace between Persia and Greece was formalized, eventually, in a document we call the Peace of Callias, negotiated around 449 before the Common Era, in which Persia agreed not to send warships into the Aegean, and Athens agreed to stop stirring up the Ionian Greeks. The terms were practical, and the peace was real, whatever the moralists on either side said about it. The Greek cities of Asia Minor remained Persian subjects. The great Ionian cities of Ephesus and Miletus and Halicarnassus, where Herodotus was born, and from which he carried his stories to the world, continued under Persian satrapies, and most of them were not unhappy about it. The culture that flowered in those cities in the 5th and 4th centuries, the culture that produced Herodotus and Hippocrates and Thales and the great Ionian philosophers, was a hybrid culture, Greek in language and intellectual tradition, but shaped by its position at the junction of the Greek and Persian worlds, absorbing influence from both, and producing something neither could have produced alone. Because this is one of the things most easily missed when the story of Persia is told through the lens of the Persian Wars. The Persian Empire was not the enemy of Greek culture. It was, for much of the 5th and 4th centuries, its most important patron. Persian gold, the famous Persian gold that Greek politicians were accused of taking throughout the Peloponnesian War, funded Greek mercenaries, supported Greek tyrants, built Greek temples in the Ionian cities. Persian administrative prestige filtered through the Greek world, influencing the way Greek cities thought about governance, treasury, and law. Persian artistic traditions flowed westward through the Ionian cities and showed up in Greek metalwork, textile, and architecture. The Greeks and Persians were enemies in a story that both sides found useful to tell. They were also, and at the same time, the closest neighbors on earth, separated by a strip of sea, deeply interpenetrated by trade and travel and the simple human curiosity of people who live near each other. The enmity was real. The entanglement was realer. We have been speaking, for many hours now, of kings and campaigns and the large movements of power, because that is what the sources give us most of, and because the drama of empires tends to collect in the decisions of the people at the top. But the Persian Empire was not its kings, any more than a forest is its tallest trees. The Persian Empire was the tens of millions of people who lived within its borders, who farmed its fields and fished its rivers, who worked in its markets and served in its armies, who worshipped their gods in temples that the Persian administration protected and maintained, who lived whole lives in which the name of the great king was something invoked in oaths and stamped on the coins they used, and occasionally, if they were important enough, encountered in person at the court, but which was, for most purposes, simply the distant sky above the daily life of the plain. Let us descend from the palace and spend an hour at ground level, because the empire at ground level is where it becomes human. In the villages of the Nile Delta, Egyptian farmers worked the same fields their ancestors had worked for 3,000 years, paying their taxes in grain now to a Persian satrap rather than an Egyptian pharaoh, which made a difference some days, and no difference at all on other days, and which they mourned or accepted or ignored depending on who their individual administrator happened to be. In the mountain valleys of Anatolia, Lydian herdsmen drove their flocks up to the summer pastures and back down in autumn, exactly as they always had, the Persian conquest invisible in the seasonal rhythms of the pastoral life. In the Babylonian city, scribes pressed cuneiform into clay, and the temples kept their accounts, and the astronomers watched the stars from the rooftops. The great city now formally under Persian rule, but practically much as it had always been. The administrative change felt mainly in the name of the ruler stamped on the official correspondence, and the language used in the royal proclamations. The great diversity of the empire meant a great diversity of lived experience within it. A Phoenician merchant sailing out of Sidon or Tyre, the Phoenician cities were autonomous client states, furnishing ships and sailors to the Persian fleet in exchange for political independence and trading privileges, lived in a world of astonishing connections, his ships known in every port from the mouth of the Nile to the coasts of Spain, trading in the purple dye that made his people's name synonymous with colour itself. A Greek mercenary in Persian service. And there were always Greek mercenaries in Persian service, for the Persians valued Greek infantry above almost all other soldiers and hired them in great numbers throughout the 5th and 4th centuries, lived the strange dual life of the professional soldier of a foreign power, fighting in campaigns from Egypt to Babylonia, returning to his Greek city with Persian silver in his purse and Persian habits of mind in his head. A Jewish scribe in the Babylonian diaspora, working in the rebuilt communities that Cyrus had authorized, was living in a world in which Persian imperial tolerance was the political fact that made possible the cultural revolution of the Second Temple period, the writing and editing of the Hebrew scriptures, the development of synagogue worship, the theological transformations that would eventually produce the monotheism that half the modern world practices. The empire held all of these lives simultaneously, and the miracle of it, if miracle is not too strong a word, is that it held them without demanding that they all become the same thing. The Persian model was not assimilation, it was coordination. You could be Babylonian and Persian at once, you could be Jewish and Persian at once, you could be Greek and Persian at once, and many people were. The identity was additive, not substitutive. And this, more than any battle or any building, is what made the Achaemenid Empire genuinely novel in the history of power. The idea that an enormous political entity could be built not on the erasure of difference, but on its management, not on the insistence that everyone become Persian, but on the insistence that everyone pay taxes and accept the king's ultimate authority and otherwise, within those constraints, remain whatever they were. It is an idea with a future. We are still trying to work out what to do with it. In the year 401 before the Common Era, something happened that revealed, more clearly than any battle or any inscription, the deep internal tensions of the Achaemenid system, and that also gave the world one of the greatest adventure stories in ancient literature, a story of survival and endurance, and the astonishing stubbornness of 10,000 men who refused to die. It begins with a prince, and a throne, and the oldest motive in the world. Darius the Good had died in 404, and the throne had passed to his eldest son, Artaxerxes the Good. But there was a younger son, also named Cyrus, after the great founder, a flattery of naming that proved, in retrospect, to carry expectations the empire could not contain. This younger Cyrus was a remarkable figure by all accounts. Energetic, personally brave, generous to his followers in the Persian tradition of gift-giving that bound the nobility to the crown, and consumed by the conviction that the throne should be his, rather than his elder brother's. He had been given command of the western satrapies by his father, a position of great power and wealth, governing most of Anatolia from his base at Sardis, and he used those years to build, carefully and covertly, the military force he would need to challenge Artaxerxes. Among the instruments he recruited were Greek mercenaries, gathered from various sources with various pretexts, until he had assembled a force of perhaps 13,000 men, the core of what history would call the 10,000. The campaign was brief. Cyrus marched east from Sardis with his army, the Greek mercenaries and the Persian forces together, covering the vast distance from the Aegean coast to the heart of Mesopotamia, a march of over 1,500 miles, with extraordinary speed. The two armies met at Cunaxa, north of Babylon, in September of 401. The battle was going well. The Greek mercenaries in particular had swept all before them, when Cyrus, unable to restrain himself, charged directly at his brother's position in the center of the Persian line, trying to end the war with a single personal stroke. He came close. He wounded Artaxerxes, and then he was killed, by a javelin or a spear, the accounts vary, and without him, the whole enterprise of the younger Cyrus collapsed in an instant. His Persian followers surrendered or were hunted down. His Greek mercenaries were left, 10,000 strong, in the middle of the Persian Empire, 1,000 miles from home, their employer dead, their position entirely hopeless. The Persian commanders invited the Greek generals to a parley to discuss terms. At the parley, the Greek generals were seized and killed, and the 10,000 were alone. What happened next is told in one of the great books of antiquity, the Anabasis of Xenophon, the march up country, the march back, the incredible story of 10,000 men electing new leaders from among themselves, forming a democracy of the desperate, and marching north through mountains and rivers and enemy territory, and the killing cold of the Armenian winter, fighting every day, losing men every day, living off what they could find or take, for a journey of 3 months and nearly 1,000 miles, until one cold morning they climbed the last pass of the mountains of Pontus, and the men in front began to shout, and the shout passed back through the column, and men who had not wept through months of hardship began to weep. And it was because the men in front could see, gleaming far below in the winter light, the Black Sea. "Thalata! Thalata!" they shouted. "The sea! The sea!" They were going home. They had made it through the empire that was supposed to be impenetrable, through the heart of the most powerful state on earth, and they had made it through by sheer collective will and the ruthless democracy of people who had nothing left to lose but their lives, and no authority to appeal to but their own shared decision. It is one of the most human stories in all of ancient literature, and it is, in a sense, the Persian Empire telling us something about itself, that the greatest power on earth could not stop 10,000 desperate men with a direction and a vote. Before we come to the end of the story, and the end, when it comes quickly, as ends in history tend to, let us spend one more hour in the living empire, in the things it built and sustained and spread across the world that were not armies or walls or inscriptions, but the softer and more durable creations of a civilization at the height of its reach, the trade, the language, the flow of ideas and objects and people that made the Persian world, in some ways, more genuinely connected and more genuinely cosmopolitan than any world that had yet existed. The Persian Empire, at its height, controlled every major trade route of the ancient world. The royal road from Sardis to Susa carried not just royal dispatches, but merchants and goods of every kind. The sea routes of the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, long established by the Babylonians and the South Arabians and the Indians who had traded on them for centuries, were now under the umbrella of Persian imperial administration. The ports of the Gulf protected by Persian authority, the trade guaranteed by the stability the empire imposed. The Silk Road, in its earliest and most embryonic form, the overland routes connecting the Iranian plateau to Central Asia and beyond, was opened up and partially organized by the Persian expansion eastward. Products that had been the luxuries of kings became the goods of merchants and the ordinary comforts of the prosperous. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, tin from the mines of Central Asia, silk from somewhere even further east, the source still mysterious, still partly legendary, Indian spices, Egyptian grain, Pontic fish paste, Lydian metalwork, Phoenician purple. The empire was, among other things, a market, the largest market the ancient world had yet produced, the first genuinely continental economy, a space within which goods moved with relative freedom and relative safety from one end to the other, subject to the same tolls and the same courts and the same guarantee of the king's peace, and with goods moved language. The administrative language of the Persian Empire was not Persian. It was Aramaic, the Semitic language that had already been spreading as a lingua franca across the Near East in the Assyrian and Babylonian periods, and that the Persian administration adopted and imposed as the common tongue of official correspondence across the whole empire. From Egypt to Bactria, a royal scribe could write in Aramaic and be understood. From the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau, merchants and officials and travelers used Aramaic as the common currency of communication. This had an extraordinary long-term consequence. Aramaic became the mother of scripts and languages across a vast swath of the world. The Hebrew square script that is used to write Hebrew today derives from the Aramaic script of the Persian period. The Arabic script that is used to write Arabic and Persian and Urdu derives from a later form of Aramaic. The scripts of Central Asia, Sogdian, Syriac, and their descendants, all flow from the same Aramaic original. In spreading Aramaic as the administrative language of half the world, the Persian Empire planted a linguistic seed whose descendants are still growing today, in the calligraphy of the Quran and the typography of the Israeli newspaper and the prayer language of the Syrian Christian Church, and with language moved ideas. The Persian period was one of the great ages of religious and philosophical ferment in human history, an axial age, as the philosopher Karl Jaspers called it, in which, almost simultaneously, and perhaps not coincidentally, the great minds of Greece and India and China were all asking the same fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the basis of ethics, the relationship between the human and the divine. Confucius in China, the Buddha in India, the pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece, all were at work in roughly the same century as Cyrus and Darius were building their empire, and the Persian Empire was not incidental to this. It was the connective tissue, the great carrier medium across which ideas could travel, in the minds of traders and diplomats and mercenaries and exiles and the endlessly moving population of a world-spanning state. The Jewish theological revolution of the Persian period, the Greek philosophical encounters with Persian wisdom, the transmission of Babylonian astronomy to the Greek world and eventually to India, all of it was facilitated by the fact that the empire existed, that the roads ran, that the sea routes were open, that there was, for the first time in history, something like a connected world in which ideas could travel as far as ships and camels and human curiosity could carry them. High on a cliff face in western Iran, on the road between Babylon and Ecbatana, at a height of 100 meters above the valley floor, there is a carved panel that Darius the Great ordered cut into the living rock when he had finished putting down the revolts of his early reign and wanted the world to know it so badly that he cut the message in 3 languages and had the cliff face smoothed and the road below rerouted so that every traveler would look up and see it, the carved figures and the columns of text, proclaiming in Persian and Elamite and Babylonian the achievement of the King of Kings, the defeat of the lie, the victory of Ahura Mazda. He also, according to his own text, sent copies of the inscription to every corner of the empire, clay tablets and papyrus scrolls carrying the same message to every province, so that every people in their own language would know what had been done. For 2,000 years, the Behistun inscription was there, visible to anyone who looked up from the road below, but unreadable, the languages forgotten, the scripts undecipherable, just patterns of marks on a cliff face that local tradition called the work of the mythical hero Farhad, who had carved it for love of a queen. And then, in the 1830s and 40s, a young British army officer named Henry Rawlinson, serving in the region, became obsessed with it. He had himself lowered on ropes down the cliff face to copy the inscriptions, hanging in the wind above the valley floor, transcribing column after column of the cuneiform text onto paper, and then, working from a hunch that the 3 languages were parallel texts of the same content, the same hunch that had cracked the Rosetta Stone a generation earlier, and drawing on the work of other scholars across Europe who were making similar attempts at the problem, Rawlinson broke the code. He deciphered the old Persian cuneiform, and then the Babylonian cuneiform, and in doing so gave the modern world access to all the cuneiform literature of the ancient Near East, the Hammurabi Code, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Star Diaries, the administrative records, the school tablets, the whole vast documentary heritage of the oldest civilization on Earth, which had been sitting in its unreadable wedges since the last priest who could read them died, waiting for someone to find the key. The key was on a cliff in western Iran, put there by Darius to proclaim his own glory, preserved for 2,500 years by the very height that made it safe from vandalism, and decoded by a man hanging on a rope in the wind. It is one of the great ironies of the history of knowledge that a king's monument to himself became, by accident of survival and the ingenuity of a curious officer, the key that unlocked the entire ancient Near East. Darius got more than he bargained for. He got immortality, of a kind he never imagined. The 4th century before the Common Era was, for the Persian Empire, a century of decline by degrees, not the sudden catastrophic collapse of a diseased system, but the slow erosion of capacity that afflicts every very large organization that has been in existence for a long time, as the original energy of the founders dissipates into bureaucratic habit, and the administrative genius of the early kings is replaced by the court intrigues and the satrapial ambitions and the dynastic murders that are the occupational hazards of absolute power without institutional constraint. The satraps grew more powerful and more independent. Egypt revolted and remained independent for 60 years, the one great success of anti-Persian resistance, a fact that the Egyptians and the modern world have found more interesting than the Persians apparently did, since the Persians made no sustained effort to reconquer it for decades. Greeks meddled in Persian affairs, and Persians meddled in Greek affairs, in an endless dance of mutual interference and mercenary hiring that would have appalled the straightforward antagonism of Marathon and Thermopylae, but that actually made more practical sense as a long-term strategy for both sides. The empire lurched, and then, in 359, a king came to the throne who was willing to do what was necessary to pull the empire back from the edge of dissolution, regardless of the personal cost to anyone who stood in his way. His name was Artaxerxes III, and he was, by the standards of late Achaemenid monarchy, a figure of almost old-fashioned ruthlessness. He began his reign by having his brothers killed, all of them, all the alternative claimants, a bloodbath of dynastic consolidation that his milder predecessors had shied away from and that the court had come to regard as optional. It was not optional. He reconquered Egypt in 343, crushing the independence that had embarrassed the empire for 60 years and reinstalling Persian rule in a manner that was considerably less gentle than the administration of Cambyses or the original conquest of Cyrus. Temples looted, local resistance crushed, the lesson of imperial supremacy delivered in the language of force rather than tolerance. He dealt with the satraps who had been playing at independence, reducing them to their proper subordination. He was, by every measure, effective. He was also hated by the Greeks and the Egyptians and many in his own court, with a ferocity that his predecessors had not inspired. He was poisoned in 338 by his chief minister, a eunuch named Begos, the second time in the Achaemenid story that a eunuch had been instrumental in the killing of a king of kings. Begos killed his sons as well, put a puppet on the throne, killed the puppet, and briefly ran the empire through another puppet before that puppet. Darius III, the last Achaemenid, turned on Begos and forced the eunuch to drink the poison he had prepared for others. Begos died. Darius III was king. And from the northwest, from the small kingdom of Macedon that no one in the Persian court was taking seriously enough, something was moving that would bring the whole edifice down. His name was Alexander. He was 20 when he became king of Macedon in 336, after his father Philip II was assassinated at a wedding stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, in a murder whose ultimate author may never be entirely certain, though the Persian gold that was found on the assassin's body suggested to many that the empire had paid for the removal of the man who had been planning to invade it. If it was Persian gold, it was the most expensive mistake the empire ever made, because it did not remove the threat, it accelerated it. Alexander, inheriting his father's army and his father's plan, had the bodyguard executed and the court consolidated within days, and within 2 years was crossing the Hellespont into Asia, leading a Macedonian and Greek army of perhaps 40,000 men against the largest empire on earth. He was 22 years old. He would be dead at 32. In between, he would conquer everything. The Persian response to the initial invasion was characterized, fatally, by a failure of nerve at the strategic level. The first battle, at the Granicus River in 334, was a Persian tactical decision to fight on ground that favored the Macedonians rather than the Persians, the Greek mercenaries, who advised the Persian commanders to avoid pitched battle and pursue a strategy of attrition and denial, were overruled by Persian nobles who thought it beneath their dignity to avoid a fight. The Persian cavalry fought bravely, and the Greek mercenaries in Persian service died fighting to the last. But Alexander broke through, and the northwestern satrapies were open. He moved down the Ionian coast, liberating the Greek cities and presenting himself as the liberator from Persia, which worked, partly, though many of those cities had been quite comfortable under Persian rule and were not entirely sure liberation was what they wanted. The second battle, at Issus in 333, was the decisive one in human terms, because it was the battle where Alexander and Darius III met in person for the first and last time. Darius commanded the Persian army himself, the king of kings, in person on the battlefield, as Achaemenid tradition demanded, and when the Macedonian cavalry broke through and came driving toward the royal chariot, Darius fled. He left his army, his mother, his wife, his daughters, his treasury, and his royal tent, all of which fell into Alexander's hands. Alexander treated the captive royal family with courtesy and, if the sources are to be believed, with a genuine chivalry that impressed even the Persians. Darius's mother was treated as a queen. His wife and daughters were given the honors of their rank. The women of the royal household were not abused. It was Cyrus at Sardis all over again, almost the conqueror demonstrating magnanimity, the conquered enemy's dignity preserved. Alexander was not unconscious of the parallel. He was, in many ways, consciously Cyrus-like, or trying to be. The third and final battle, at Gaugamela in 331, on the plain of the Tigris, near the ruins of Nineveh, ended the Persian Empire in an afternoon. Darius had chosen a great flat plain where his numbers would tell, had prepared the ground, had assembled everything the empire could still field. Alexander broke the line in the center, drove for the royal chariot, and Darius fled again. This time there was no recovery. The Persian army dissolved. Babylon opened its gates, as it had opened for Cyrus 2 centuries before. Susa fell. Persepolis, the great city of kings, the city of the nations, the ceremonial heart of the whole Achaemenid enterprise, fell to Alexander in 330, and in a night of celebration that has never been entirely explained, deliberately ordered, or drunken accident, or the suggestion of an Athenian courtesan named Thais, or all three at once, the palaces of Persepolis were burned. The great cedar-roofed Apadana, the audience hall of 100 columns where the tribute-bearers had marched in their carved procession for 2 centuries, burned through the night, and the columns fell, and the roof went up in a blaze, visible for miles across the plain of Fars, and the Persian Empire was, in that fire, over. Darius III was murdered by his own satrap, Bessus, while fleeing eastward, stabbed and left by the road. Alexander found the body and gave it a royal burial. He declared himself the avenger of Darius, the legitimate heir of the Achaemenid throne, the rightful king of Persia and of Asia. It was, in its way, the last Achaemenid act, the claim of legitimacy, the insistence that what had been done was not conquest but succession, not destruction but continuation. The names at the top had changed. The empire, in Alexander's design, would go on. Alexander burned Persepolis, but he could not burn what Persepolis had built. He conquered the Persian Empire in a decade, but he could not conquer the Persian idea, which was older and stranger and more durable than any palace or any army. And this is one of the most remarkable things in the whole story, that the man who destroyed the Achaemenid dynasty became, in the process of destroying it, profoundly Persian, and that his successors, the Greek generals who carved up his empire after his death at 32 in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, became more Persian still, adopting the administrative structures and the court ceremonies and the royal ideology that the Achaemenids had spent 2 centuries perfecting. Alexander, after the conquest, began to dress in Persian robes, partial Persian dress at first, a concession to the eastern part of his new empire, then more and more fully, until his Macedonian companions grumbled that he had gone native, that he had been corrupted by the luxury of the East, that the boy who had slept on the ground and shared the hardships of the common soldiers was now requiring his generals to prostrate themselves before him in the Persian manner, demanding the proskynesis, the full prostration before the king, that the Persians gave their ruler, but which the Greeks regarded as an act appropriate only before the gods. Alexander wanted both identities, Greek conqueror and Persian king, Achilles and Cyrus at once, and the tension between them ran through the last years of his reign like a crack in a palace wall. He married Persian noblewomen. He incorporated Persian nobles into his cavalry and his administration. He planned, near the end, to relocate the capital of his empire to Babylon, making the ancient holy city the center of a genuinely fusion world, Greek and Persian and Babylonian and Egyptian and everything else all at once, under one king. He died before he could do it. But the impulse was there, and it was Achaemenid. His successors, the Seleucids, who took the eastern part of his empire, ruled as Persian kings under Greek names, maintaining the satrapy system, funding the old temples, governing through a bureaucracy that was Persian in all but its letterhead. The Parthians, the Iranian people who eventually displaced the Seleucids in the 3rd century before the Common Era, ruled explicitly as the heirs of the Achaemenids, claiming the Persian royal tradition and the Persian royal ideology, reviving the old administrative forms and the old religious prestige. And the Sasanian Persians, who displaced the Parthians in the 3rd century of the Common Era and ruled for 400 years until the Arab conquest, saw themselves as the true restorers of the Achaemenid ideal and carved inscriptions in the old manner and ruled from the old plateaus, and kept the fire burning on the altar of Ahura Mazda in the temples that the Zoroastrian priests had maintained, in an unbroken tradition, from the age of Cyrus to the age of Muhammad. The flame went out. In the end, or rather was transformed, carried by the Zoroastrian communities that survived the Arab conquest, into the diaspora of India and Iran, where the Parsis and the Iranian Zoroastrians keep it burning still, 2,500 years after Cyrus the Great first declared himself the servant of Ahura Mazda, and set his armies in motion across the plateau toward the gate of Babylon. That is a very long time for a flame to keep burning. But then, the Persians were always, in their deepest nature, patient people. People of the long view, people who understood that the plateau was older than any empire, and the mountains older than any king, and the fire older than any hand that tended it. Let that patience be yours for a moment. Breathe. The fire has been burning for 2,500 years. It will still be burning when you wake. If sleep is coming for you, let it come. This is what the night is for. Before we let the plateau recede into the dark behind us, we should gather the gifts, the things that Persia gave the world so quietly and so long ago, that the world received them without noticing, and uses them now without remembering where they came from. Because in the category of unacknowledged debts, the debt the world owes to ancient Persia is among the largest and the least recognized, and it is worth sitting with, for a moment, in the quiet before sleep. Begin with the garden. The Persian word is peridesa, and it meant an enclosed space, a walled garden, a park, the green and watered paradise that the arid plateau made peculiarly precious, a place where water was directed and plants were cultivated, and the harshness of the land was temporarily overcome by human ingenuity and care. The Greeks borrowed the word, paradiasos, and used it for the great royal parks of the Persian kings, the enclosed hunting grounds and pleasure gardens that surrounded the Persian palaces. And then the word travelled into the Hebrew scriptures, into the Greek New Testament, and became, by the natural association of a beautiful enclosed garden with the perfection of divine creation, the word for heaven itself, the garden at the end of time, the paradise that the righteous will inherit. The word for heaven in half the languages of the Western world is a Persian word for a walled garden. Every time someone speaks of paradise, they are, without knowing it, speaking of a Persian park. The game of chess, or at least the transmission of it to the Western world, came through Persia. Chess originated in India, almost certainly in some form, but it travelled west through the Persian Empire, where it was played at court and described in Persian texts, and it came to the Arab world as shatranj, a Persianized form, and from the Arab world to medieval Europe. The chessboard with its kings and queens and knights and bishops and pawns, the whole elaborate metaphor of power and war that has occupied human minds for 1,000 years, passed through the Persian world on its way to ours. The postal system. The organized relay of riders and horses along maintained roads, carrying messages at speed across great distances, was a Persian invention, or at least a Persian perfection. The idea that the state had an obligation to move information reliably and quickly across its territory, and that this required a dedicated infrastructure of stations and animals and riders, is first fully realized in the Persian royal road and its relay system. Every post office in the modern world, every mail service, every courier network, is the distant descendant of the institution that Herodotus described, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night, standing in the relay stations of Darius's empire. The idea of human rights, in its ancient, imperfect, partial but genuine form, runs through the Persian imperial project in ways that are sometimes difficult to separate from propaganda but that reflect a real administrative commitment. The Cyrus Cylinder, which explicitly declares the freedom of deported peoples to return home and worship their own gods, is the oldest document in history that reads like a statement of what we would now call human rights principles. The right of people to live in their own land, to worship in their own way, to not be subjected to forced resettlement for political purposes. The United Nations, in the 1970s, made a replica of the Cyrus Cylinder part of its headquarters collection, honoring it as an ancient precursor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whether this is historically exact or anachronistically optimistic is a question scholars debate. What it captures is something real, that the Persian imperial model, at its best and most intentional, embodied a vision of tolerated diversity and of the limits of state power over individual conscience that was genuinely new in the history of politics, and that casts a long shadow forward into the ideals, however imperfectly realized, of later ages. The fire burns on. In the small Zoroastrian temples of India and Iran, on altars tended by priests, whose lineage of service runs back to the Achaemenid age. The sacred fire of Ahura Mazda burns, as it has burned for 2,500 years, kept alive through conquest and conversion and diaspora and the long indifference of history. The living symbol of an empire that built the largest state the ancient world had seen and then watched it taken from them in a decade. And who kept the flame anyway? Because the flame was older than the empire and would outlast it. Because the truth that the flame stood for, that the world was made for goodness, that light would defeat darkness in the end, that the count was not finished until it was finished, was not dependent on any king or any palace or any army for its survival. It depended only on the willingness of someone to tend it. There is always someone willing to tend it. That, in the end, is the most Persian thing of all. The empire fell. The language lived. This is perhaps the deepest surprise in the whole Persian story, and it requires a moment of attention even at this late and sleepy hour, because it is genuinely astonishing. Old Persian, the language of Cyrus and Darius, the language of the great inscriptions, died as a spoken tongue with the Achaemenid Empire, replaced in the Persian heartland first by the Aramaic of the administration, and then by the Middle Persian of the Parthian and Sasanian periods. But it did not die in the way that, say, Sumerian died, or Etruscan died, leaving nothing but itself. It transformed, it evolved, it became, over the centuries, New Persian, Farsi, the language that was written by the great Persian poets of the medieval Islamic period in the Arabic script that the Arab conquest brought with it, but in a voice unmistakably their own, expressing a sensibility unmistakably Persian, drawing on images and themes and ways of feeling that ran back, in their deepest roots, to the plateau and the mountains and the fire and the long Iranian memory of the world before Islam came. Rumi, who is today perhaps the most widely read poet in the United States, wrote in Persian, in the New Persian of 13th century Anatolia, where he lived most of his life, but Persian nonetheless, in the tradition of Persian mystical poetry that had been evolving since the 9th century. The Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, the Book of Kings, the great national epic of Iran, composed around the year 1000 of the Common Era, tells the mythological and historical story of the Persian kings from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest, preserving in its 60,000 couplets a vision of Persian identity and Persian kingship and Persian heroism that reaches back, through layers of oral tradition and written transmission, to the world of the Achaemenids and beyond. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, in the 19th century translation of Edward Fitzgerald, that made it famous in the English-speaking world, is a 12th century Persian text about wine and roses, and the brevity of life, and the uselessness of theology, in the face of a good cup of wine drunk under a flowering tree. Sentiments that the court of Persepolis would have understood immediately that the pleasure gardens of the Achaemenid palaces were designed to express. The voice of ancient Persia, transformed beyond easy recognition but never silent, speaks in all of these, and in the literature and music and miniature painting of the Persian world from the 7th century to the present, one of the longest continuous cultural traditions on earth, older than the Christian Church and older than Islam, rooted in the highland valleys and the sacred fires of a plateau that has been Iranian for as long as anyone can remember. Come back, at the end, to where we began, to the plateau, to the mountains, to the high cold country where the story started. Come back to Pasargadae, the first capital, the city that Cyrus built in the fertile valley of the Murghab, and that his successors abandoned for the grander stages of Persepolis and Susa and Ecbatana, leaving it as a kind of sacred relic, the founding place, the origin point that later Persian kings returned to for the ceremony of their investiture, to receive the satrapy of the Persians and eat the ritual meal of figs and sour milk that symbolized the simplicity of the old life before empire and luxury came. Most of Pasargadae is rubble now, scattered blocks of white limestone across a flat plain, the stubs of columns, the outlines of palace walls readable in the archaeology, but not in the standing stone. The gardens are gone, the paradise, the walled garden that surrounded the palaces, through which the carefully channeled water ran in stone channels that are still there, still visible, still showing you where the water went though no water runs in them now. The gatehouse is there, partly, two of its columns standing, with the carving of a four-winged guardian figure still clear on the stone. One of the strangest images in ancient art, a figure that combines elements from every culture the empire contained, Assyrian and Egyptian and Persian, a composite being guarding the entrance to a composite palace. And in the plain, a little removed from the palace ruins, on its stepped white limestone base, the tomb of Cyrus. It is modest. That is the first thing anyone says about it, after they have come to it with the expectation of what the founder of the greatest empire of the ancient world ought to be buried in. The expectation of pyramid-scale grandeur, of the kind of monument that says to the future, "Look how great I was." The tomb of Cyrus says no such thing. It is a gabled chamber, perhaps 6 meters tall, sitting on a base of 6 wide steps, in a style that has been compared to Anatolian tomb architecture and to the simpler funerary buildings of the early Iranian world. Modest, clean, proportioned, made to last rather than made to impress. In the starlight of a clear Iranian night, with the mountains on every side and the plain empty and the stars of the plateau blazing overhead in the way they only blaze when there is no city for 100 miles to compete with them, the tomb of Cyrus is one of the most moving things in the world, not because it is grand, because it is not. Because the man who could have built anything chose to be buried in this, a room. A simple room on a hill, in the valley he came from, under the stars of the plateau he was born on. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my body. Stand there in the imagination, in the dark, with the mountains and the stars and the quiet, and let the whole story wash over you. The shepherd king who came from nowhere and took the world, the tolerance and the fire and the roads, the procession of the nations carved in stone, the weeping exiles set free, the bridge of boats and the 300 at the pass, the Behistun inscription hanging on its cliff face, the garden that became paradise, the flame that never went out. All of it came from here, from this plateau, from this hard, beautiful, cold country, from people who believed that the world was made for goodness and that the truth would win in the end, who built roads so that messages could travel faster, and gardens so that beauty could exist in the desert, and an empire so that the many peoples of the earth could, for a time, live under the same sky without being required to be the same. They did not always live up to that ideal. No one ever does. But they held it, and they built toward it, and they left it in the stone and the fire and the language for the people who came after, which includes us, here, tonight, in the dark, on the other side of 2,500 years, still carrying, without quite knowing it, the things they made and the ideas they had and the word for heaven that their gardeners gave us. Paradise, the walled garden, the green and watered place where the water runs in stone channels and the fire burns at the altar, and the stars of the plateau shine down on the simple tomb of a man who gave the Persians their empire, and asked, at the end, only not to be begrudged a little earth. Let the mountains hold it. Let the fire tend itself tonight. Let the roads go on into the dark. You have travelled far enough. Sleep now. The plateau is wide, and the sky is full of stars, and the tomb is white in the moonlight on its stepped base in the valley, and the inscription above the door, if it was ever really there, is too dark to read tonight, and it does not need to be read, because you already know what it says. I am Cyrus. I gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth. The stars are doing it. The mountains are doing it. The fire is still burning somewhere, in a temple in Yazd, or a house in Mumbai, on an altar that has not gone cold in 2,500 years. You may go to sleep. The flame will keep till morning. Sleep well, travellers. The plateau remembers everything. There is a practice that runs through the whole Achaemenid period like a golden thread, binding the king to his nobility, and the nobility to their people, in a web of obligation and gratitude and display that was, in Persian political culture, as important as any law or any army, the practice of the royal feast. To be invited to the king's table was not merely a social distinction. It was a political statement, a mark of favour, a signal to the whole court about where power lay and whose star was rising. To be excluded from the table was, correspondingly, a kind of social death. And the table itself, the physical reality of what was served and in what quantities and with what ceremony, was one of the primary instruments of Persian kingship, the place where the abstract claim of royal supremacy became concrete in the daily ritual of eating and drinking together. The scale of the Persian royal table was, to outside observers, almost incomprehensible. Greek writers who had access to the records or to the testimony of people who had served at court described daily provisions for the king's household that read like the supply list for an army. Hundreds of sheep and cattle and poultry, thousands of measures of grain and wine and oil, jars of sesame and cumin and coriander from the eastern provinces, sweet dates and dried figs and Syrian raisins, pickled fish from the coasts, fresh game from the royal hunts. Much of this went not to feed the king himself. No one man could eat so much. but to feed the vast household that surrounded him, the nobles and officials and guards and servants and craftsmen and musicians and physicians and priests, and the hundreds of people whose job it was to keep the machinery of the royal household running. The king's table was not a table, but an institution, a redistribution mechanism, a way of ensuring that the wealth of the empire flowed outward from the center in a daily cascade of provisions, binding the recipients in a loyalty that was as much economic as political. The wine was important. Persia was a wine culture. The great vineyards of the Iranian plateau and of the western satrapies produced wines that were the luxury goods of the ancient world, and the Persian nobility drank with a seriousness that the Greek observers sometimes found excessive and sometimes found admirable. Persian wine vessels, the golden rhytons, the drinking horns shaped as animal foreparts, the shallow ceremonial bowls, are among the most beautiful objects the Persian world produced, and they appear in the archaeological record across the whole empire, from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, tracing the spread of Persian court culture through the physical object of the noble's drinking vessel. The great banquets of the Persian court were occasions not just for eating and drinking, but for music. The musicians who performed at the royal table occupied a recognized and honored position in the household. The sounds they made a part of the official atmosphere of royal magnificence, and for the exchange of gifts. For the Persian king was expected, at the great feasts, to give as well as to receive, to distribute textiles and metal vessels and jewelry and land and money and horses to the deserving nobles in the audience, the redistribution of wealth that was the living expression of the royal claim to the world's abundance. There was protocol of extraordinary complexity governing every aspect of who could approach the king, how far, in what posture, on what occasions. The proskynesis, the prostration before the king, the full-body bow that so offended the Greek companions of Alexander, was the normal greeting of a Persian subject to his lord, a physical enactment of the hierarchical order of the universe, in which the King of Kings stood at the apex and every other human being occupied a position defined by their distance from him. The curtains and screens and chamberlains who controlled access to the royal presence were not merely the servants of royal vanity. They were the mechanisms by which the king's time and attention were rationed among the thousands of people who needed or wanted them, creating a system of controlled access that functioned as both security and as one of the most valuable currencies in the court economy. A man who could get you before the king was worth cultivating. A man who could keep you away from the king was worth fearing. The army that built and sustained the largest empire the ancient world had seen was, like everything else about that empire, a thing of extraordinary diversity. A gathering of the peoples of the earth under Persian command, each contingent fighting in its own traditional manner with its own traditional weapons, the whole coordinated by a Persian officer corps that knew, from long experience, how to combine the skills of 100 different martial traditions into something that could move and strike and hold territory across a span of terrain from Mediterranean coast to Indian steppe. It was the most complex military organism that had yet existed, and at its heart, providing its most reliable and most feared corps, was the corps that every Greek who had faced them remembered with a combination of dread and admiration: the Immortals. The Immortals, the Persian name for them, was probably something like the Anusia, the Companions, with the 10,000 elite Persian and Median infantry who formed the personal guard of the King of Kings and the shock force of the Persian army. Their name came from their number. Whenever one was killed or sick or for any reason removed from the corps, he was immediately replaced, so that the number was always exactly 10,000, the corps always at full strength, never diminished by battle or disease, always 10,000, as if death itself could not reduce them. The image this created, of a force that could not be made smaller, that renewed itself like the fire on the altar, that was in a sense immortal as an institution even as its individual members died, was not accidental. It was the kind of symbolic thinking that ran through the whole Persian imperial program, the translation of ideology into military reality. The Immortals were equipped in the Persian manner: a wicker shield, a short spear with a silver or gold pomegranate counterweight at its butt, the silver for ordinary Immortals, the gold for the eunuch commanders, a composite bow, a quiver of arrows, a short sword at the hip, a long tunic of fish-scale armor under their robes. They were not heavy infantry in the Greek sense. They were not men who put on bronze plate and locked shields and charged. They were a combined arms unit who could shoot from a distance and fight at close quarters, who could skirmish and hold a position and form a reserve. Against the Macedonian phalanx of Alexander, they were outmatched. The long pikes of the Macedonians reached farther than their spears, And the discipline of the Macedonian formation was the product of Philip II's military revolution, something Persia had simply not yet encountered. But against every other army the Persians had faced for 2 centuries, the Immortals had been enough. Beyond the Immortals, the army of the empire was a true world army. The cavalry, Persian and Median and Bactrian and Saka horsemen, was the arm that the Persians valued most highly, and the plains of the Iranian plateau and Central Asia gave them an almost unlimited supply of the horses and the horsemen who rode them. The infantry from every province fought in their own way. Lydian and Ionian hoplites with Greek-style armor, Ethiopians with palm-wood bows and stone-tipped arrows and lion skins and red and white body paint, Indians with cotton-stuffed armor and cane bows whose arrows could penetrate bronze, Phoenician and Egyptian sailors who became the backbone of the Persian fleet, Arab camel riders who could cross terrain no other force could cross. The problem of commanding this diversity, of coordinating units that did not share a language or a tactical tradition or a chain of command, was solved by the Persian officer corps, the Persian and Median nobles, who served as the links between the great king and his world army, translating royal intention into military action across the whole vast machine. When it worked, it produced a force of terrifying scale and flexibility. When it didn't work, when the coordination broke down, when the command structure fractured at the key moment, when one part of the army fled and the rest were left exposed, it broke catastrophically, as it did at Issus and Gargamella, because an army of many peoples fighting in many ways has many potential points of failure, and a failure in one part cannot be compensated for by the courage of the others. The women of the Achaemenid world are among the most fascinating and most elusive figures in the whole story, present everywhere in the actual functioning of the empire, largely invisible in the official record, and occasionally erupting into the historical sources with a force that suggests, in the moments we can see them clearly, women of extraordinary capability and will, operating within, around, and sometimes against the structures that were supposed to contain them. At the very top, the queens and the queen mothers of the Achaemenid house occupied positions of formal honor and informal power that were, by the standards of most ancient societies, remarkable. They had their own households, their own estates, their own administrative staff, their own seal. The seal of the queen's household was a legal instrument, capable of authorizing payments and receipts in the official economy of the empire. We know this not from the literary sources alone, but from the archive of clay tablets found at Persepolis, the Persepolis fortification tablets, tens of thousands of administrative records covering the years around the turn of the 5th century, recording the movement of goods and rations and payments through the royal economy, and among those records, appearing frequently and with a matter-of-fact regularity that suggests routine rather than exception, are authorizations issued by women of the royal house. Erteshtona, wife of Darius, receiving rations and issuing travel documents. Artistone, another wife of Darius and apparently his favorite, administering estates of her own in several provinces. The Queen Mother Parysatis, whose name appears in the records in connection with substantial economic activities. These are not the women of the harem fantasy, the passive creatures of Ottoman imagination projected backward onto a world that did not produce them. These are women managing property and issuing administrative orders, and traveling with their households across the empire on their own authorizations. Women who were, within the space the system allowed them, active economic agents in the most bureaucratically sophisticated state of their age. That the space was bounded, that they could not command armies or hold satrapies, or appear in the great public rituals of the court as principles rather than ornaments, is true, and the limits were real. But within those limits, the women of the Achaemenid house had scope that their counterparts in the Greek world, officially the home of democracy and free citizenship, largely did not. An Athenian woman of the same period could not own property, could not appear in court, could not sign a contract. A royal Persian woman could do all of these things within the administrative structure of the empire, and some of them did. The most politically formidable of all the Achaemenid women was probably Parysatis, mother of Artaxerxes II and of the younger Cyrus, who played a role in the succession crisis of 404 that the ancient sources describe with a mixture of awe and horror. When her younger son Cyrus was captured after a failed assassination attempt on his older brother, Parysatis intervened with the king to spare his life, and succeeded, which suggests a degree of influence over the King of Kings that is hard to overstate. When Cyrus was killed at Canaxa, Persepolis spent years pursuing revenge against everyone she held responsible for his death, reportedly with the patience and the cunning of a woman who had spent a lifetime in a court where open power was unavailable to her, and every objective had to be pursued through indirection and patience, and the management of those who held the formal authority she could not hold herself. She is said to have poisoned enemies, suborned officials, and maneuvered her son the king into actions that served her purposes, without his always understanding why. Whether all the details are true is uncertain. The ancient sources were fascinated by her, and may have exaggerated, but the outline of a woman of commanding intelligence operating through every available means in a system that denied her direct power seems real. She was the ultimate insider, playing a game that had no formal rules because women were not supposed to be playing it at all. We spoke earlier of the garden, of the paradisa, the walled enclosure, the Persian word that became paradise. But it deserves more than a passing mention, because the Persian garden was not merely an aesthetic achievement or a linguistic accident. It was one of the central expressions of the Persian worldview, the place where the abstract theology of Ahura Mazda's creative goodness became visible in the organized beauty of water and plant and stone, and where the ideal of the Persian Empire, the bringing of order to diversity, the making of abundance from harshness, the insistence that the world could be made beautiful by human intention and human care, was enacted on the small scale of a walled enclosure that anyone could walk through and understand. The Persian garden had, from its earliest form on the plateau, a characteristic structure: 4 quadrants divided by channels of water, the water running in the straight lines of human direction rather than the curves of nature, feeding trees and flowering plants and grass in a country where grass required deliberate effort to grow. The 4-part division, the Chahar Bag, the foregarden, seems to have had a cosmological meaning connected to the 4 directions and the 4 elements, though the exact theology is difficult to reconstruct. What is clear is that the form was canonical and persistent. The Achaemenid royal parks at Persepolis and Pasargadae and Susa were organized around water channels and planted with trees and flowers brought from every part of the empire, the garden as microcosm of the imperial diversity, the plants of 100 lands growing together in the king's park as the peoples of 100 lands marched together in the king's procession. The garden was the empire made beautiful. The empire was the garden made large. This form travelled. When the Arab conquerors of Persia adopted Persian administrative and artistic traditions, as they did, with remarkable speed and thoroughness, they adopted the Persian garden as well, and the Chahar Bag became the basis of the Islamic garden tradition that produced the Alhambra in Spain, and the Taj Mahal in India, and the great gardens of Mughal Lahore and the Ottoman court at Topkapi. When the Silk Road carried Persian aesthetic ideas eastward, the 4-part garden form influenced the Chinese imperial garden tradition in ways that scholars are still tracing. And when the European powers of the early modern period came into contact with Persian and Mughal gardens through trade and travel and conquest, they carried home an idea of the garden as a formal structure of water and symmetry and enclosure that influenced, in diffuse but real ways, the garden traditions of France and Italy and England. The garden at Versailles, with its straight canals and geometric plantings and controlled water, is a very distant cousin of Cyrus's paradise at Pasargadae, so distant that the family resemblance is barely visible. But the family is there. The water still runs in straight lines, by human intention, in the direction of human beauty. The idea persists. Let us walk, for a last hour, in the empire, not in the palaces and the courts and the great ceremonial spaces, but on the road, where most people most of the time actually experienced what it meant to live in the Achaemenid world. Because the empire, at ground level, was above all a road, and the road is where you felt it. In the maintained surface under your feet, in the posting station ahead with its fresh horses and its official stores of provisions, in the other travellers sharing the road with you, the merchant and the official and the soldier and the pilgrim and the artist commissioned for a distant court, in the tolls you paid at the checkpoint and the documents you carried in your belt pouch that identified you as a legal traveller on the King's Highway. The royal road ran, at its full extent, some 2,500 kilometres from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland, with branches extending to Persepolis and Ecbatana and Babylon and the eastern satrapies. It was not a single road in the modern sense of an engineered highway with a consistent standard, but a network of maintained routes, some sections stone-paved, others graded earth, others simply well-worn tracks that the constant traffic of the imperial economy had beaten into the landscape. What made it the royal road was not the engineering, but the infrastructure, the posting stations at regular intervals, stocked with horses and provisions, and manned by officials who checked the documents of travelers and logged the movement of official dispatches and kept the king informed of what was moving through his empire and in what direction and why. To travel the road was to travel through the empire in a very literal sense, to pass through its diversity and sequence, as if reading the procession at Persepolis from left to right. Leaving Sardis on the Aegean, you pass through the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, and then into the Lydian countryside, where the old aristocracy still spoke their own language and the temples of their old gods stood alongside the Persian administrative buildings that had been erected to oversee them. Crossing into the Anatolian plateau, the land opened out into the wide high country of the Phrygians and the Cappadocians, ancient peoples with their own traditions who had been folded into the empire without losing the character that the landscape had given them. Pastoral, horse raisings, connected to the seasonal rhythms of the high country rather than the commercial rhythms of the coast. Descending toward the Euphrates and crossing into the Assyrian plain, you entered the old heartland of Mesopotamian civilization, where the cities of the plain, Nineveh in ruins, Babylon still magnificent, Nippur and Ashur, and the lesser cities dotting the flat brown landscape, were the most ancient places on earth, their antiquity pressing on everything, the consciousness that you were walking on ground where human beings had been living and building and writing for 3,000 years before the Persians arrived. And then east, across the Zagros mountains and through the high passes, the road dropping down at last into the Iranian plateau and the cities of Persia itself, Susa, Persepolis, Pasargadae, the heart of the empire, the place where the king of kings lived and the fire burned and the garden grew. 3 months on foot, Herodotus said, a week by royal relay, in between, in the ordinary pace of a merchant's caravan or an official's cavalcade. Perhaps 6 weeks, 6 weeks of changing landscape and changing language and changing food and changing gods, all of it somehow held together by the same administrative logic, the same currency, the same posting stations and official seals and royal documents, the same distant figure of the king in his golden throne at the center of it all, keeping the whole improbable collection of the human world in motion. That is the empire at ground level, a very long road and a great deal of changing, and the extraordinary fact that for 2 centuries it mostly worked. The Persians made beautiful things, and the beautiful things they made, the gold rhytons and the carved stone reliefs, and the glazed brick friezes and the woven textiles and the carved cylinder seals, deserve an hour of attention, not merely as aesthetic objects, but as a language, because that is what they were. A visual language in which the empire expressed what it thought about itself and what it wanted the world to think about it, as deliberately and as carefully as Darius carved his self-justifications on the cliff at Behistun. The gold. The Persians were obsessed with gold, with the making of it into objects of extraordinary technical refinement and symbolic weight, with the giving of it as gifts and the wearing of it as marks of rank, with the accumulation of it in the royal treasury as the physical substance of imperial power. The Achaemenid goldsmiths produced work that in the precision of its casting and the sophistication of its design has rarely been surpassed in the metalworking tradition of any later age. The animal style that appears in Persian gold, the gold ram's head terminals of a bracelet, the gold lion attacking a bull on a handled vessel, the gold griffin rendered in perfect detail, with every feather of its wings and every scale of its body individually articulated, draws on the ancient Iranian tradition of the steppes and the nomadic peoples of the plateau, but transforms it in the court workshops of Persepolis and Susa into something more refined and more monumental. The vigor of the nomad's art combined with the technical polish of craftsmen working at the expense of the richest court on earth. The armlets and bracelets and torques of gold that appear in the Persepolis reliefs on the arms and necks of the Persian nobles, and in the surviving examples in the great museums, are objects of such quality that modern goldsmiths examine them with something close to despair. The granulation, the filigree, the casting of hollow forms, the inlaying of coloured stones, all executed with a precision that the tools available should not, by rights, have been able to achieve. That they did achieve it is one of the minor miracles of ancient craft, the product of a tradition of goldsmithing that had been developing on the Iranian plateau and in the workshops of Babylon and Lydia for centuries before the Achaemenids gave it the resources of an empire. The goldsmiths who made those objects are nameless to us. The Persepolis records list their rations, but rarely their individual work. But the objects they made are among the finest things any human being has ever produced, and they sit in the cases of the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Louvre and the National Museum of Iran, waiting for someone to look at them as long and as carefully as they deserve. And then the stone. The carving at Persepolis, the long processions on the stairway walls, the combat scenes on the column bases, the winged discs of Ahura Mazda above the royal figures, the king on his throne, supported by the representatives of all his subject peoples, is one of the great achievements of ancient relief sculpture, comparable in its own terms to the Assyrian palace reliefs or the Egyptian temple carvings, but quite different from both in its purpose and its effect. Where Assyrian relief is kinetic and violent, all charging horses and crumbling cities and impaled enemies, and Egyptian relief is theological and monumental, the Persepolis carving is processional and dignified, organized around the idea of order and participation, rather than around the idea of conquest and domination. The figures march, they do not fight. They carry gifts, they do not drag chains. The tone is formal and serene, as if what is being carved is not history but the ideal form of history, not what actually happened when the nations submitted to Persia, which was often violent and always coercive, but what it means, at its best interpretation, for many peoples to be gathered under one roof. Whether this gap between the ideal carved in stone and the reality experienced by the subject peoples constitutes propaganda or aspiration is a question the stone does not answer. It simply keeps marching, patient and dignified, the 23 delegations in their 23 costumes, forever presenting their 23 gifts to a king who is always receiving, never tiring, never looking away. The real governing of the Persian Empire happened not at Persepolis, but in the satrapies, in the provincial capitals that each satrap made into a miniature court, reflecting the grandeur of the great king's court at a suitable distance and on a manageable scale. The satraps were among the most powerful individuals in the ancient world, lords of territories that were themselves empires by any previous standard. The satrapy of Egypt was the wealthiest province in the world. The satrapies of Asia Minor controlled the great commercial cities of the Aegean coast. The eastern satrapies of Bactria and Sogdia controlled the trade routes to India and China. A satrapy like Lydia, administered from Sardis, was in direct contact with the Greek world across the Aegean, absorbing Greek mercenaries and Greek artists and Greek philosophers, and projecting Persian administrative culture back across the water in return. The satraps who ran these provinces were almost always members of the Persian and Median nobility, the great families of the plateau, the men who had fought with Cyrus and Darius, and had been rewarded with provinces to govern and daughters of the royal house to marry. They lived with an opulence that sometimes alarmed the centre, and with an independence that grew, over the course of the 4th century, into something very close to de facto sovereignty. The satrapy revolts of the early 4th century, the so-called revolt of the satraps, revealed how far the balance of power had shifted from the centre to the periphery, as satrap after satrap asserted near independence, minted his own coins with his own image, hired his own mercenaries, conducted his own foreign policy. Artaxerxes III pulled them back, briefly, with the ruthlessness we have described, but the tendency was irreversible. In a polity this large, held together by roads and loyalty and the personal prestige of the king, rather than by any truly national identity or institutional mechanism of enforcement, the edge would always be pulling away from the centre, the provinces always exploring how much independence the centre could be made to tolerate. The satrapies were also, at the same time, the places where Persian culture most intensely mixed with the cultures it governed, producing the hybrid aesthetic and intellectual achievements that are among the most interesting things the empire generated. The sculptors and architects who worked in the Ionian satrapies of Asia Minor were producing, in the 5th and 4th centuries, work that was neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something in between. The great tomb of the Carian dynast Mausolus at Halicarnassus, the mausoleum, was built in a style that synthesized Greek sculptural tradition with Persian architectural scale, decorated by the best Greek sculptors of the age, and conceived by a non-Greek dynast who was both a Persian vassal and a passionate admirer of Greek culture. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and its very name, mausoleum, became the common word for any monumental tomb in every language that borrowed it. A Carian client king, ruling under Persian overlordship, commissioning a tomb that synthesized Greek and Persian and local traditions, and bequeathing to the languages of the world a word. This is the empire at the edges, doing what empires at their edges always do, producing something that the centre alone could never have produced, a hybrid more durable and more generative than either of its parents. We have spoken of the Zoroastrian fire that burns on the altar of Ahura Mazda, but let us spend one last hour with it, not as theology or history, but as a physical reality, a living practice, because the fire at the heart of the Persian religious world was not a metaphor, it was a flame. It was tended by actual human beings, the Magi, who were not magicians in the later Western sense, but the priestly clan of the Iranian world, the keepers of the sacred tradition, the men who maintained the fire and led the rituals and interpreted the will of Ahura Mazda for the community of believers. The Magi were among the most remarkable figures in the Achaemenid world, a priestly class that was also an intellectual class, keepers not just of the ritual tradition, but of a body of knowledge that included astronomy and medicine, and the interpretation of dreams and the law of the natural world. The Greek word magos, from which our magic and magician directly derive, originally meant simply a member of this Iranian priestly class, and the word carried, at first, no more mystical connotation than priest. The mystical connotation came later, as the reputation of the Magi for knowledge and wisdom filtered westward through the Greek world, accumulated the projections of a culture fascinated by Oriental wisdom, and eventually produced the image of the wise men from the East, who appear in the Christian nativity story. The Magi, the three kings of Western tradition, who follow a star to a stable in Bethlehem. They are, in the imagination of the Christian West, the last representatives of the Zoroastrian priestly tradition, the keepers of the sacred fire, the watchers of the stars, the men who understood the signs in the heavens and followed them to whatever they pointed toward. Whether they are historically real or theologically symbolic, they carry in themselves the long thread of Zoroastrian stargazing and Babylonian astronomy and Iranian priestly learning that runs all the way back to the plateau and the high cold nights when the Magi first watched the stars and tried to read the will of the wise Lord in their movements on those high cold nights. On a clear Iranian night at altitude, where the air is thin and the stars are extraordinary, where the Milky Way blazes in a way that people in the light-polluted modern world have largely forgotten stars can blaze, the Magi kept their watch, tending the fire and reading the sky, practicing the discipline of attention that was the basis of both their religious vocation and their intellectual achievement. They were, in a sense, the direct ancestors of both the astronomer and the priest, the two roles not yet separated, the attention to the heavens still carrying both the scientific and the spiritual charge that they would only gradually, over the following centuries, divide between them. The star watcher who follows a moving light across the sky and concludes that something unprecedented is happening in the world. That is a magus doing exactly what Magi did. The scientist who points a telescope at the same sky and measures what the instruments show, that is the same impulse, disciplined by a different tradition. The vigil is the same. The fire is the same. Let it burn then, in the imagination, on the altar of the high plateau, under the vast Iranian sky. Let the Magi tend it through the night, as they have tended it for 2,500 years, through conquest and conversion and diaspora and the long turning of the world. The fire does not care about history. The fire is not interested in empires. The fire burns because someone lights it and someone tends it, generation after generation, because the truth it represents, that light is better than darkness, that goodness is better than evil, that the world was made for something better than what we too often make of it, is worth the keeping. The Zoroastrians who tend those flames tonight, in Yazd and in Mumbai and in the small communities scattered across the modern world, are the last direct heirs of the civilization we have spent this night exploring. They did not ask to be the survivors. They simply did not stop. They kept the fire going, through everything, because that is what you do with a fire. You do not let it go out. You do not let it go out. Sleep now. The plateau is dark and the mountains are dark, and the tomb in the plain at Pasargadae is pale under the stars. The fire burns somewhere in the dark, small and warm and patient, waiting for the morning that the Zoroastrians always believed would come, the morning at the end of time when the world would be renewed and truth would finally, completely win. It has been waiting a long time. It is practiced at waiting. It is not in any hurry. Neither are you, tonight, in the dark, with all the time in the world ahead of you, and the long story of Persia settling gently around you like snow on the high passes of the Zagros, quiet and clean and cold, covering everything, making everything equal and new and still. The King of Kings is in his little room on the hill. The fire is burning somewhere. The stars of the plateau are blazing in their ancient courses, in the paths the Babylonian astronomers first charted and the Persian Magi first interpreted, wheeling around the pole in their endless patient processional, the sky's own procession of the nations, doing what they have always done. Go to sleep. I am Cyrus. I gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth. The mountains will keep it till morning. The fire will keep till morning. Sleep well, travelers. The plateau remembers everything, and forgives everything, and goes on. For most of the long period between the Arab conquest of Iran in the 7th century of the Common Era and the great age of European archaeological exploration that began in the 19th, ancient Persia was known almost exclusively through its enemies. The Greeks had written about it extensively, vividly, and with a combination of genuine fascination and contemptible bias. The Hebrew scriptures mentioned Cyrus and Artaxerxes. Later classical writers had preserved fragments of Persian history filtered through Greek and Roman eyes. But the Persians' own voice, their own records, their own literature, their own administrative documents, was silent, buried under the rubble of Persepolis and the accumulated mud of the centuries, waiting for someone to dig it up and learn to read it. The first person to make serious progress was Henry Rawlinson, whose adventure on the cliff face at Behistun we have already described, hanging on ropes in the wind, copying the trilingual inscription that Darius had cut there 2,500 years before, and then spending years in London and Calcutta working out, with the help of other scholars across Europe, the key to Old Persian cuneiform. By the 1840s and 50s the script was essentially deciphered, and the voice of the Achaemenid kings was available again for the first time since the death of the last priest who had been trained to read it. Darius spoke. Xerxes spoke. Artaxerxes spoke. The inscriptions at Persepolis and Bisens and Susa, and the dozens of other sites where the royal texts had been carved, gave up their content. And the picture that emerged was both what the literary sources had suggested, and very different from it. More internally consistent, more ideologically coherent, more clearly the expression of a genuine political philosophy, rather than the oriental despotism of the Greek imagination. And then the archaeologists came. The great excavation at Persepolis, partly by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in the 1930s, partly by Iranian archaeologists in the decades that followed, uncovered not just the magnificent stone monuments, but the administrative archive of the Persepolis fortification tablets, 30,000 clay tablets recording the daily transactions of the royal household economy, the rations paid to workers, and the provisions issued to travelers, and the wages of the craftsmen, and the allocations of wine and grain and livestock that kept the machinery of the royal capital running. They are not dramatic documents. They are ledgers, accounting records, the paperwork of a great institution. But they are irreplaceable, because they give us the empire at ground level, the empire as it was actually administered day by day, and they show us women and workers and travelers and officials going about their business in a way that no inscription and no royal monument can show. They are the underside of the great carved procession, the human reality behind the ideal image. Those tablets are still being studied. The Oriental Institute has been publishing them for decades, and new readings and new insights emerge from them every year, because there are so many of them, and they are so dense with detail, that the work of understanding them is genuinely a generation's labor. The ancient world keeps giving back what it was thought to have lost. The voice of the Persepolis workers, and their women, and their children, and their livestock, speaking in Elamite cuneiform from 30 clay tablets found in the ruins of the treasury of the King of Kings, to scholars sitting in Chicago and Tehran and London, 2,500 years after the clay was pressed. The empire went to sleep under the rubble. The records kept. The diggers came. The voice came back. It always comes back. You cannot bury the past deeply enough to keep it from speaking, eventually, to someone willing to listen. We come, at the last, to the question that has been implicit throughout the whole night. What did Persia give us? Not in the limited sense of specific inventions that can be traced back, the garden, the postal relay, the word for paradise, but in the deeper sense of what the Persian experiment in empire taught the world about what an empire could be, and what the Persian civilization contributed to the long, tangled, unfinished project of human self-understanding. The Persian Empire was the first, in the literal, historical sense of being the first in time, to demonstrate that it was possible to govern a territory containing radically diverse peoples, languages, religions, and customs under a single administrative authority without requiring cultural uniformity, and to do it on a scale that encompassed half the known world. This demonstration had consequences. Alexander the Great, who destroyed the Achaemenid dynasty, was so impressed by what it had built that he tried to become it, tried to rule as a Persian king as well as a Macedonian one, to synthesize rather than to erase. The Romans, who built the next great universal empire, were influenced in their approach to provincial governance by the Persian model as it had been filtered through the Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander. The Islamic Caliphate, which in the 7th century conquered both the Sasanian Persian Empire and the Byzantine Roman one, absorbed the Persian administrative tradition so thoroughly that Persian became the language of Islamic governance, and Persian cultural forms shaped the whole of Islamic civilization from Andalusia to Indonesia. The Mughal Empire in India was Persian in language and culture. The Ottoman Empire in Turkey conducted much of its administration in Persian. The long tradition of Persian poetry and Persian miniature painting and Persian architectural ornament spread through the Islamic world and beyond, shaping the visual and literary cultures of peoples who had never been part of the original Persian Empire. And then there is the idea, the one idea perhaps, that is most genuinely Persian, and most genuinely important, and most genuinely alive in the world today, even though almost no one thinks of it as Persian when they encounter it. The idea that the purpose of political power is the protection of the weak from the strong, that the legitimacy of a ruler depends on his service to those he rules, that peoples have a right to live in their own lands and worship their own gods and practice their own customs without being required to become someone else. This idea, which Cyrus expressed in the language of Zoroastrian theology and Babylonian political tradition, which Darius inscribed on the walls of Persepolis and claimed as the foundation of his authority, which the Cyrus cylinder articulated in a form recognizable as a statement of human rights. This idea has never stopped being relevant, and has never stopped being contested, and has never been fully achieved anywhere, and that is exactly why it matters that it was articulated, clearly and in writing, 2,500 years ago by a king standing on the steps of a conquered city and telling its people they were free. The idea that power has limits, the idea that the strong shall not oppress the weak, the idea that the diversity of human beings is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be respected. These ideas did not originate with Cyrus. The tradition behind them is much older, running back through Babylon and Sumer to the very beginnings of human political thought, but they were given their first imperial form, their first expression as the organizing principles of a state that actually had the power to enforce them, by the Achaemenid Persians on the Iranian plateau in the cold centuries before the Common Era, when the fire was first lit on the altar and the King of Kings first declared himself the servant of truth. That flame is still burning, imperfectly, intermittently, always at risk of going out, always tended by someone willing to tend it. It burns in the language of every human rights declaration since the Cyrus cylinder. It burns in the aspiration, however imperfectly realized, of every multi-ethnic democracy trying to hold together peoples who would rather not share a country. It burns in the Zoroastrian fire temples of Yazd and Mumbai and Los Angeles, tended by priests whose lineage of service runs back to the Magi on the plateau. It burns, if you look for it, in the stars above Pasargadae on a clear night in autumn, the same stars the astronomers watched from the rooftops of Babylon and the Magi read for the will of the wise Lord, the same stars that Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes and all the kings of Persia saw when they looked up from their power into the indifferent dark and remembered, for a moment, that they were mortal. The count is not finished until it is finished. The plateau is wide, the mountains are old, the tomb is white in the moonlight on its stepped base in the valley of the Murghab, and the stars above it are blazing in the way they only blaze when you are far from the city, and the night is clear and the world is quiet and there is nothing between you and the sky but the thin cold air of the plateau and the faint sweet ghost of the oldest smoke in the world. Sleep now. The fire will tend itself tonight. The mountains will keep what they always keep. The road runs on into the dark, the posting stations empty, the horses resting, the relay that carried the king's word faster than the wind standing quiet until the morning brings some new message to carry. There is no message tonight. There is only the dark, and the stars, and the old plateau, and the long, long sleep of everything that has done its work and been laid down. I am Cyrus. I gave the Persians their empire. I do not begrudge you this little rest. Sleep well, travellers. The plateau remembers, the fire burns, the morning will come. The Persian Empire was, among other things, the largest economy the ancient world had yet produced, and understanding how it worked and how it was possible is essential to understanding how the whole improbable structure held together across 2 centuries and 20 million square kilometers. Because empires do not run on ideology alone, however powerful, they run on resources, and the management of those resources is the most fundamental test of any imperial system. The Achaemenids passed that test with a sophistication that would not be equaled in the Near East for a very long time. At the foundation was tribute. Every satrapy paid tribute to the center, a fixed annual assessment in silver, or in commodities that could be converted to silver, calculated in proportion to the province's assessed wealth, and collected by the satrap's administration, and forwarded to the royal treasury at Persepolis or Susa or Ecbatana. Darius formalized and rationalized this tribute system early in his reign, and the list of what each province paid, recorded by Herodotus in one of his most reliable passages, clearly derived from some official Persian source, gives us a snapshot of the relative wealth of the empire's component parts. Egypt paid 470 talents of silver, Babylonia 1,000 talents, the Indian satrapy 360 talents of gold dust, the richest assessment in the empire. The Ionian cities in Asia Minor various sums. The total, aggregated, was staggering. Perhaps 14,000 talents of silver per year in the assessment, with additional payments in kind, additional revenues from royal lands and royal industries, and the profits of the royal trade monopolies. Much of this wealth went back out again, of course, in the wages of the army, in the construction costs of the great building programs, in the gifts that the king's generosity required him to make to his nobles and his allies and his dependent rulers, in the maintenance of the road system and the posting stations and the canal networks and the irrigation infrastructure of the agricultural provinces, without which the tax base would shrink. The great royal treasury at Persepolis, whose contents Alexander found when he captured it, amounting to perhaps 120,000 talents of silver and gold, the accumulated savings of 2 centuries of imperial tribute, was not hoarded for its own sake, but held as a strategic reserve, a buffer against the shocks that any system as complex as an empire would inevitably suffer. It was the largest concentration of precious metal in the world, and its capture by Alexander allowed him to fund his subsequent campaigns in a way that would otherwise have been impossible, which is one of those ironies of history in which the victim's greatest strength becomes the instrument of his conqueror's further conquests. Beyond tribute, the empire generated wealth through the royal monopolies on key commodities, and through the fees and tolls of the road system, and through the enormous economic activity that the imperial infrastructure itself stimulated. The royal road was not just a government facility, it was a commercial highway that every merchant with goods to move could use, paying the tolls at the checkpoints and benefiting from the security and the maintained surface and the official facilities that the empire provided. The Phoenician merchant fleets that operated under Persian protection in the eastern Mediterranean were the instruments of a trade that enriched the empire through fees and taxes, while enriching the Phoenician cities through their profits. The agricultural development of the satrapies, the canal projects, the irrigation extensions, the settlement programs that the Persian administration actively promoted in the less developed parts of the empire, generated long-term increases in the tax base that were the deliberate result of deliberate policy, the empire investing in its own productivity with the patience of a state that expected to be there to collect the return. The daric, the gold coin of the empire, named for Darius, stamped with the image of the running archer king, was the first coin to function as a true international currency, recognized and accepted across the whole extent of the ancient world from Greece to India, because the purity and consistency of its gold content were guaranteed by the Persian treasury and trusted by everyone who traded in it. It was, in the economic life of the ancient Near East, what the dollar or the euro is in the modern international economy, the benchmark, the standard, the coin everyone would take. The Greeks, who hated Persia most passionately, still took Persian gold when it was offered, and it was often offered in the form of subsidies to one Greek city or another fighting its neighbors, the Persian treasury funding Greek divisions with a strategic patience that was one of the most successful foreign policies of the 4th century. The Persian gold that corrupted Greek politicians, as the Athenians loudly complained, was doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping the Greek world too busy fighting itself to seriously threaten the Persian West. And finally, before sleep takes everything and leaves only the plateau and the fire, let us sit for one last hour with what may be the most important fact of all about the Persian world, a fact so large that it is easy to look straight through it without seeing it, that the civilization we call classical, the civilization of Athens and Sparta and the Greek miracle, the civilization whose philosophy and mathematics and drama and democratic theory we claim as the foundation of the West, was not produced by the Greeks alone. It was produced by the Greeks in permanent, intense, creative, sometimes violent dialogue with Persia. And the Persia that shaped it was itself permanently, intensely shaped by the Greeks. The two civilizations were not separate. They were aspects of each other, mirror images facing each other across the narrow waters of the Aegean, each one making the other what it was. Think of the great historians. Herodotus, the father of history, the man who invented the prose narrative of the past in the Western tradition, was from Halicarnassus, a city on the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, part of the Persian Empire for most of his life, a place where Greek and Persian and Carian and Phoenician culture met and mixed in exactly the way the empire was designed to facilitate. His great history, the Histories, was written specifically to explain the Persian Wars to a Greek audience, which meant explaining Persia to Greece, which meant traveling the Persian Empire, talking to Egyptians and Babylonians and Lydians and Persians, gathering the stories that people tell about themselves, and weaving them into a portrait of the human world that was not Greek-centric, but genuinely cosmopolitan, genuinely interested in what it was like to be Babylonian or Egyptian or Persian or Scythian, genuinely curious about the diversity of human custom and belief. He invented history, and he invented it in the service of understanding Persia. History as a discipline is in its origin a Greek response to the problem of Persia. Think of the great drama, Greek tragedy, the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, the theatrical form that shaped Western drama for 2,500 years, was deeply marked by the Persian encounter. Aeschylus's Persians, the oldest surviving complete play in the Western canon, is not a celebration of Greek victory, but a meditation on Persian defeat, showing the Persian court receiving the news of Salamis from the Persian point of view, giving the Persians grief and dignity and political intelligence, rather than reducing them to stereotypes. Aeschylus fought at Marathon. He could have written a play that simply celebrated Greek triumph. Instead, he wrote a play that imagined what it felt like to lose. That is not the product of a civilization that thought Persians were simply barbarians to be despised. It is the product of a civilization that had looked at the Persians long enough and closely enough to understand that they were human. And think of the philosophy, the great intellectual revolution that produced Plato and Aristotle, the revolution that invented systematic philosophy, the discipline of asking not just what the world is like, but why it is like that, what the nature of reality is, and what the good life looks like, and what justice requires, happened in precisely the cities that were most deeply exposed to Persian culture, the Ionian cities of Asia Minor, where Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes and Heraclitus did their thinking, cities that were part of the Persian Empire, cities that were in constant contact with the Persian court, and with the Babylonian astronomical and mathematical tradition that the Persian administration made available. The connection between Babylonian mathematical and astronomical knowledge, transmitted through the Persian administrative network, and the early Greek development of mathematics and cosmological theory, is one of the most interesting and least fully explored problems in the history of ancient thought. The point is not that the Greeks copied the Babylonians, but that the encounter with a tradition of systematic record-keeping and mathematical thinking gave the Greek mind something to work with, a tradition to respond to, an existing achievement to surpass or transform. The great ideas do not come from nothing. They come from the friction between different ways of thinking, from the heat generated when one tradition meets another, and each one is forced to reconsider what it thought it knew. The Persian Empire was the medium in which that friction happened, the space in which Greek and Babylonian and Egyptian and Persian thinking met and argued and generated something that none of them could have generated alone. What does this mean for us? Here, at the end of the night, settling into the dark with the whole long story of Persia washing over us. Perhaps only this, that the world we live in is not the product of any single civilization, however great, that the things we value most, the philosophy, the mathematics, the drama, the idea of rights, the very word for heaven, came to us through a process of encounter and exchange and friction that required many different peoples living close enough to each other to argue and to borrow and to be changed by the argument. The Persian Empire made that encounter possible, at a scale and for a duration that had never before been achieved. It brought the peoples of half the world into the same administrative space, within earshot of each other, within trading distance of each other, within the reach of each other's ideas. It did not make them the same. It made them neighbors, and from the neighborhood, from the long, difficult, productive, sometimes violent proximity of peoples who were not the same, but who were compelled to deal with each other, came the civilization we have inherited, which is richer and stranger and more various than any one of those peoples could have imagined. The fire is burning. The stars are blazing. The road runs on into the dark, carrying whatever messages the morning will bring. You have come a very long way tonight, from the cold plateau and the tomb in the valley to the throne room of Persepolis and the pass at Thermopylae and the burning palaces and the long twilight of the empire that would not quite die. You have earned your sleep. I am Cyrus. I gave the Persians their empire. Somewhere tonight, in a temple in Yazd, in a prayer room in Mumbai, in a quiet house in London or New York where the old faith is still kept, a flame is burning on an altar, as it has burned for 2,500 years, without a night off, without a single extinction, passed from hand to hand across the centuries by people who did not let it go out because they believed, as Zarathustra taught, as the Magi knew, as the fire itself insists, burning steadily in the dark. That truth is worth the keeping, and that light, in the end, is stronger than whatever extinguishes it. Do not begrudge me this little earth. The plateau is wide, the stars are old. Sleep well, travellers. The empire is gone, the fire is not. Among the Greeks who spent time at the Persian court, the most intimate were the physicians, because the King of Kings needed doctors as much as any mortal, and the Persians, who were happy to use the best of whatever their empire offered, were happy to use Greek doctors. The most famous of them was a man from the island of Cnidus, named Ctesias, who served as court physician to Artaxerxes II for 17 years in the late 5th and early 4th centuries, and who used his extraordinary position, with access to the royal household, to the women's quarters, to the confidential business of a court that was otherwise almost entirely closed to foreigners, to write histories of Persia and Assyria that are among the most valuable and most frustrating documents of the ancient world. Valuable because he was there, because he saw and heard things that no Greek in Athens or Sparta could ever have known. Frustrating because he was also a tremendous embellisher, a man who could not resist improving a good story, whose accounts of palace intrigue and royal murder and harem politics are so much more vivid and sensational than anyone else's, that scholars have spent 2 centuries arguing about how much of it to believe. What is unambiguously true is that Ctesias was there, present at the Battle of Cunaxa, where the younger Cyrus was killed, treating the wound that Cyrus himself had given Artaxerxes before he died, moving in the innermost circles of the greatest court on earth for 17 years, and then going home to write about it with the breathless enthusiasm of a man who had seen the most extraordinary things imaginable and could not quite believe his luck. His histories survive only in summaries and quotations in later authors, which is itself a kind of tragedy. The eyewitness to the Persian court filtered through the summaries of Byzantine scholars 1,000 years later, the original lost somewhere in the great destruction of ancient literature that the Middle Ages accomplished. But what survives is enough to give us glimpses of the court that no other source provides. The women and the eunuchs and the murders and the medicines and the everyday texture of a life lived inside the palace walls of the King of Kings. As a physician, Ctesias represents a tradition that the Persian court took seriously and invested in heavily. Persian medicine in the Achaemenid period was a blend of traditions. The ancient Mesopotamian tradition of the Asu, the physician who treated the body with herbs and bandages and careful empirical observation, and the tradition of the Ashipu, the exorcist who addressed the demonic causes of disease that the physical symptoms merely expressed, mixed now with the Egyptian medical tradition, the most technically sophisticated in the ancient world, the Indian tradition, rich in the botanical knowledge of the subcontinent, and the emerging Greek tradition that was, in the 5th century, making the move toward naturalistic explanation that we associate with Hippocrates. The Persian court physician had access to all of these traditions, because the Persian Empire's policy of incorporating the best of what its subject peoples had to offer meant that the best physicians of every tradition ended up at the court, comparing notes and debating methods, and occasionally healing their patients, and occasionally killing them with treatments that were the best available to the age. The Persepolis fortification tablets include records of provisions for the sick, rations increased for workers who were ill, allocations of special foods and medicines for the households of high-ranking patients, that show a systematic approach to sickness in the labor force that was not merely humanitarian but economic. A dead or permanently disabled worker was a loss to the imperial economy, and keeping workers healthy was part of the administrative calculus. It is not, by any measure, a modern health system, but it is a systematic one, organized around the practical recognition that the empire's wealth depended on the physical capacity of the millions of people who worked within it, and that capacity had to be maintained. Every great civilization generates, in addition to its historical legacy, a legendary one, a body of stories about itself and its great figures that circulates far beyond the reach of historical fact, that is embellished and transformed and made into something that serves the needs of later tellers rather than the requirements of historical accuracy, and that is in some ways more influential than the history because it is more memorable and more emotionally compelling. Persia was no exception. The legends that grew up around Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes and the Persian world in the centuries after the Achaemenid collapse are an entire parallel history, a second Persian empire built entirely of story, and they are worth exploring briefly before we close, because they illuminate both what the Persians valued about themselves and what later peoples found compelling about the Persian example. The legend of Cyrus was the most powerful of all, and we have already encountered it in Herodotus's account of the shepherd king and the failed infanticide, the boy who was supposed to die and became the greatest king in the world instead. But this was only the beginning of the legendary tradition. In the Cyropedia, The Education of Cyrus, the Greek philosopher Xenophon, writing in the early 4th century, produced a portrait of Cyrus that is one of the most influential political texts of the ancient world, though it is almost entirely fictional, an idealized picture of a philosopher king, a ruler of perfect wisdom and justice and self-discipline, whose empire is not a conquest but a school of virtue, whose subjects are not subjects but students in the art of being well governed. Xenophon's Cyrus is not the historical Cyrus. He is a Greek projection of the ideal ruler onto a Persian screen, an argument about what kingship should be dressed in Persian clothes. But his influence was enormous. Machiavelli read the Cyropedia and was influenced by it. Thomas Jefferson owned 2 copies. Philip of Macedon gave it to his son Alexander as a model to emulate. The fictional Cyrus, the perfectly wise philosopher king of Xenophon's imagination, shaped the way the Western tradition thought about good government for 2,000 years. And then there was the Persian tradition itself, the great legendarium of the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings that Ferdowsi composed around the year 1000, which preserved in its epic poetry a vision of the Persian kings from the mythological dawn of time to the Arab conquest that was deeply informed by real historical memory, but also deeply transformed by the epic tradition's need for heroes and monsters and the great cosmic struggles of good and evil. The kings of the Shahnameh are both the historical Achaemenids and something much older, the mythological kings of the Iranian tradition, the legendary heroes of the Zoroastrian epic, the champions of Ahura Mazda against the demonic powers of Ahriman, their wars and their losses and their loves and their deaths, played out against the backdrop of a cosmos that is always teetering between order and chaos, truth and lie, the light of the sacred fire and the darkness of the dragon. It is not history in the modern sense. It is the memory of a people about who they were and what they valued and what they lost and why it mattered, expressed in the only form powerful enough to carry that weight across 1,000 years: poetry. The great epic of the Persian tradition is not carved in stone like the Behistun inscription. It lives in the voice of the reader, in the breath of the recitation, in the music that the language makes when it moves through the air. That is a different kind of monument, and a more durable one, because it does not depend on the stone remaining and the cliff not falling and the inscription being legible. It depends only on someone choosing to read it aloud, which people have been doing for 1,000 years and are doing still, in Iran and in Afghanistan and in Tajikistan and in the diaspora communities scattered across the world where Persian is spoken and the Shahnameh is loved. The empire built by Cyrus is gone. The poem built by Ferdowsi about the empire is not. And the poem is, perhaps, the truer monument, because Cyrus wanted to be remembered as a just king, and the poem remembers him as one, and nothing that has happened in the intervening 2,500 years has managed to change that. We carry the stories we choose to carry. We remember what we need to remember. The Persians needed to remember a king who gave them their identity, and a prophet who gave them their fire, and a civilization that, for 2 centuries, held the world together without requiring it to be the same. They remembered all of these things, imperfectly but persistently, through conquest and conversion and diaspora and the long silence between the fall of one empire and the rise of the next. They are still remembering them, in the language that Ferdowsi wrote in, and the fire that the Magi tend, and the garden that is still called, in half the languages of the world, by the Persian word for an enclosed and watered and deliberately beautiful place, paradise. The walled garden, the green space in the desert where the water runs in straight channels by human intention, and the fire burns at the altar, and the stars of the plateau blaze overhead in the thin cold air of the high country, and everything, for a moment, is ordered and purposeful and good. That is the Persian gift. That is the dream that the plateau gave the world 2,500 years ago, when a shepherd king stood up from his obscurity on the high Iranian plain and began to move, with the patience of a man who understands that the count is not finished until it is finished, toward the gate of the god, toward the center of everything, toward the world he was going to remake. That is the story. You have carried it this far. You may set it down now. The plateau will hold it. The fire will keep it. The morning will bring it back, changed and unchanged, as the morning always does. Sleep now. The empire is not finished. The empire is never finished. It simply waits, in the mountain and the fire, and the language and the garden, for the next person to tend it. Tonight, that person is sleeping. Tonight, that is enough. Sleep well, travellers. Cyrus waits in his little room on the hill, patient as he always was, patient as the mountains, patient as the fire. He can wait. The plateau remembers everything. Good night. The plateau is still there. The fire is still burning. The mountains are still old. And the story, the whole long, patient story of the people who came from that hard country and gave the world its hours and its paradise and its postal system and its first declaration of the rights of the conquered. The story is still being told, tonight, by you, in the dark, in the breathing quiet of a world that is still, without knowing it, living in the world they made. Sleep now. You have come far enough. The plateau will keep the rest till morning. There is one more thing we must speak of before the night closes completely, and it is alive and warm, and the colour of the plateau in autumn. The Persian horse, because no account of the Achaemenid world is complete without it, and because the horse is, in a very real sense, the physical foundation on which the whole empire was built. The Iranian plateau is horse country. It has been horse country for as long as there have been horses and people in the same place. The high meadows of the Zagros and the Alborz, and the valleys of Media and the eastern satrapies produced horses of a quality that the whole ancient world coveted, that Egypt paid for in gold, and Greece raided for in war, and that Persia used as the central instrument of both its military power and its administrative reach. The Nicaean horses, the great horses of the Median heartland, bred on the rich grass of the high valleys around what is now Hamadan, were the most prized war horses of the ancient world, larger and stronger than the ordinary horses of the Mediterranean, the heavy cavalry mounts of the Persian nobles, and the breeding stock that every conquering general from Alexander to the Parthians tried to capture and carry home. The Persian royal roads posting station system, the relay that could carry a message from Sardis to Susa in a week, was, at its mechanical heart, a system for keeping large numbers of excellent horses fed and rested and ready to run, which required the administration to breed horses, stable horses, feed horses, train riders, and maintain the whole infrastructure of equine logistics across 2,500 kilometers. The empire moved at the speed of its horses. In the great carved reliefs of Persepolis, horses appear everywhere. In the tribute processions, where various nations lead their finest animals to the king. In the hunting scenes where the king pursues his quarry on horseback. In the ceremonial processions of the Nowruz festival, where the royal cavalry rides in the great company of the court. The horse was not merely a military asset. It was a symbol of Persian nobility, the animal most associated with the free life of the plateau and the mobile power of the ruling class. To give a man a horse, one of the great horses of the Nicaean breed, with its arched neck and its deep chest, and its intelligence, was one of the highest gifts the king could bestow, and the royal gift of a horse to a deserving noble appears again and again in the sources as the physical embodiment of royal favour, the most personal of the impersonal king's expressions of value, and the horses of the plateau endured long after the Achaemenid Empire was gone. The Parthians, who created the next great Iranian empire, were above all a horse people, their famous cavalry of armoured knights, and their feared Parthian shot, the technique of shooting accurately from horseback, while appearing to flee, the arrow loosed from the turning body over the horse's flank, becoming the most famous military innovation of the Hellenistic world, and giving the English language one of its most durable idioms, the Parthian shot, the parting shot, the last word that wounds as you walk away. The horse of the plateau, the legacy of the Achaemenid breeding programs and the Median grasslands, was still winning battles centuries after the last Achaemenid king had died in a ditch with a Macedonian spear in him. Animals outlast empires, sometimes. The horses of the plateau grazed on, indifferent to the names of the men who rode them. There is a moment, at the end of every long journey, when you stop and turn and look back at the road you have travelled, and the distance of it surprises you. Not because you have forgotten how far you have come, but because the beginning is so far back now that it looks different, smaller. Seen from this distance, the mountains that were so enormous when you were among them now, a blue line on the far horizon, beautiful and manageable in a way that they were not when they were overhead. That moment is now. The road behind you runs all the way back to the cold plateau, and the shepherd king, and the ancient question of why one minor Persian tribe, in one obscure valley, at one unlikely moment in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, managed to do what no one before them had done, to take the world, and to take it in a way that left the world better for having been taken. It is not a simple story, and we have not tried to make it simple. The empire was built on conquest, and conquest is never clean. Peoples who did not wish to be part of the Persian project were made part of it anyway, by the usual instruments of ancient power: armies, sieges, fire, the persuasion of overwhelming force. The tolerance that the Cyrus cylinder proclaimed was real, and it was also convenient, and the difference between principle and policy is not always clear in the surviving evidence, and perhaps was not always clear to the Persians themselves. The great processions of Persepolis show the nations bringing tribute in dignity and freedom, and the nations bringing tribute in fact paid under compulsion, however gentle the compulsion was by the standards of the age. The fire of Ahura Mazda burned for truth, and the truth of the empire included Cambyses destroying the sacred bulls of Egypt, and Xerxes burning the temples of Athens, and Artaxerxes III ruling with a ruthlessness that earned him the fear if not the love of his subjects. But the story is not simple in the other direction either. Not simply dark, not simply exploitative, not simply the latest iteration of the ancient tyranny of the strong over the weak. The Cyrus cylinder is real. The returning exiles were real. The unprecedented institutional tolerance of the Achaemenid administration was real, measured against what had come before and what would come after. The parade of nations on the stairs of Persepolis, each one distinct and dignified, was a choice. No one required Darius to carve them that way. No external force made him include their costumes and their customs in the monumental art of his capital. It was what he chose to show the world about his empire and his intentions, and that choice matters even if the reality was more complicated than the image. Empires choose their monuments, and the monument Darius chose was a gathering of peoples, each one itself, each one present, each one included in the great human project of living under a common sky. That is not nothing. That is in fact quite a lot. What remains then, at the absolute last, when the story is finished and the fire is low and the plateau is dark, and the stars are doing what they have always done above the tomb at Pasargadae, what remains is this: the proof that it is possible. The Persian Empire is the proof that it is possible to build something very large and very diverse and hold it together without requiring it all to be the same. That the proof is ancient and imperfect, and that the empire eventually fell, does not diminish the proof. It only means that the possible thing is also difficult, that it requires constant maintenance and good judgment, and the willingness to see the people you govern as people rather than problems, and that it will fail if those things are not provided. We knew that already. The Persian Empire adds to our knowledge, not the news that empires fall. We knew that. But the proof, 2,500 years old, and still legible in the carved stone and the burning fire and the living language, that they can, at their best, aspire to something worth aspiring to. And that is the thing worth carrying down into the dark tonight, the thing worth sleeping on, the last thought before the plateau goes quiet, and the fire does its work without us, and the stars go on in their courses, patient and indifferent and beautiful, above the little earth that covers everything. I am Cyrus. I gave the Persians their empire. Sleep well, travellers. The fire will keep till morning.